Chapter 1. In the Shadow of the Andes. High in the Andean cradle, long before the gold-laden empires or the carved stones of royal cities, there were only the winds and the wanderers. The landscape stretched out with silent four-steep ridges, dusted in frost, valleys carved by time and ice, and skies that changed from silver to flame with every sunrise. In this vast, untamed land, the first footsteps did not belong to warriors or kings, but to small bands of nomads moving with the seasons. These early people came not to conquer, but to endure. They followed the movement of animals across steep passes, drank from glacier-fed streams, and built no walls. For the land itself was both home and hardship. Every day was shaped by the needs of survival. Cold nights pressed close, thin air stole breath, and the rugged terrain gave little freely. But even in this struggle, they left behind their quiet marks flint tools worn smooth from use, cave walls bearing ochre outlines of human hands, and paths etched into hillsides where thousands of careful steps had passed. Their story was not told in grand battles or royal decrees, but in the rhythm of hunting, gathering, and moving, always moving. They knew no empire, no name to give their place in time, but their presence, fleeting as it seemed, laid the first threads in the great tapestry to come. The Andes tested them. Every ridge and ravine demanded patience, ingenuity, and strength. But these early Andeans learned to read the earth like scripture. They learned which slopes warmed early under the sun, where water pooled after snowmelt, and when birds sang of coming rains. They passed this wisdom in voice and practice, parent to child, tribe to tribe. And in doing so, they did something greater than simply survive. They endured long enough to become the ancestors of civilizations yet unseen, the sacred seeds. Then, something shifted. It did not roar like thunder or blaze like fire. It came in the quiet shape of seeds, small, unassuming, yet sacred. With the discovery and cultivation of native crops, life in the Andes changed forever. Plants like quinoa, oca, and especially the potato, humble and nourishing, became the foundation of settled life. These crops, hardy and resilient, were unlike anything known to the world beyond these heights. Where other grains failed, these thrived. Even at altitudes where oxygen thinned and the sun burned too cold, the potato alone, with its 1,000 varieties, was more than food. It was a promise. It said, you can stay here, you can grow. You can dream beyond the daily chase of wild game or the fragile fruits of a wandering life. With cultivation came permanence. Families could plant in terraces carved from mountain walls. Communities could store food in earthen silos. Time, once dictated by the need to move, began to slow. People could look further into the future, into seasons, years, and generations. But these seeds were not only practical, they were spiritual. To plant was to enter into covenant with the earth. Farmers sang to the soil and thanked the sky. Every sprout was a miracle, a dialogue between the people and the mountain gods. Even today, the potato remains sacred in the Andes, not merely for its sustenance, but for its symbolism. It is the root of a way of life, the quiet revolution that turned paths into villages, and wandering clans into the ancestors of empire. Temples without ceramics, far from the highlands. Where the desert meets the sea, another miracle took shape. Along the dry coast of Peru, a civilization was rising not with spears or pottery, but with sacred design in stone. Carroll, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, Emerged around 2600 BCE, it had no ceramics, no weapons, no signs of conquest. Yet it thrived. Towering pyramids, some as tall as 7 stories, loomed above sunken plazas where people once gathered for ceremony and song. Carol's people wove intricate textiles from cotton, played music on flutes carved from pelican bones, and traded inland and along the coast with ease. Their society moved not on wheels or written words, but on shared understanding of ritual, of rhythm, and of balance. Each structure was aligned to the cosmos, built with a spiritual geometry that turned stone into sanctuary. This was not a Fama, city of warlords or monarchs. It was a city of harmony, born of silence and intention. What makes Carol so extraordinary is not only its age, but its vision. Here, in a time before the Inca or even the known gods of later myths, people were already building with purpose. No murals of blood or battle remain. Instead, we find the bones of musical instruments, reed baskets used to carry stones, and pathways etched with human thought. Carol was proof that civilization could begin not with the sword, but with the song. That grandeur could rise not from domination, but from the desire to connect to each other, to the stars, and to the spirit that shaped their world. The voice of the mountain. To live in the Andes was not simply to live near mountains, it was to live with them, to know them as ancestors, guardians, and gods. Every snow-capped peak had a name. Every stream had a soul. The people did not see nature as something to tame, but as family. They called the mountain spirits Apis, and these Apis were more than legends, they were daily presence. They shaped harvests, determined fates, and whispered in the winds that swept across the ridgelines. When clouds gathered around a summit, it was a message. When stones fell from cliffs, they were warnings or omens. People left offerings, chicha beer, coca leaves, shells from distant coasts at sacred springs or high crags, asking for guidance, for blessing, or for forgiveness. Even simple acts like planting or digging required prayer, for the earth was not inert. It listened. This deep reverence was not weakness. It was wisdom. It taught balance. It taught respect. And it laid the spiritual foundation for all that came later. The Inca, with their golden temples and vast empire, would inherit this worldview and refine it. But it began here, in the quiet centuries before empire, when the mountain itself was still the highest authority. The voice of the mountain did not command armies or issue decrees. It spoke in the slow melt of snow into spring. It murmured in the rustle of grass over terraced slopes. And those who lived here listened. In listening, they learned. And in learning, they became something more than wanderers. They became people of the earth, bound by spirit, seed, and stone to a place they now called home. Chapter 2. Cults of Stone and Jaguar. Deep in the misty folds of the Peruvian Andes, where cold rivers tumble down from icy peaks and green ridges melt into the clouds, there rests a place carved not by time, but by vision. Chaven de Huantar is not a ruin, it is a whisper in stone. It lies hidden at the meeting point of 2 rivers, as if the earth itself pointed to it. The stone walls do not rise in grandeur like later empires. Instead, they press inward, enclosing secrets. The temple feels as though it was never meant to be found easily, and once inside, it asks more questions than it answers. This ancient complex was built nearly 3,000 years ago. Its builders were not kings but priest architects, artisans of belief. From the outside, the temple seems modest, but its true wonder lies beneath in a labyrinth of narrow stone corridors that twist like veins through a living body. Within these dark tunnels, the air is cool and silent, but the walls seem to breathe. Carvings of fanged faces peer out from the shadows. Their eyes, once painted with bright mineral reds and yellows, once glowed like embers in torchlight, and through it all, a sound, the thunder of water. Beneath the temple ran a network of canals, fed by nearby streams. These weren't just for drainage. They were instruments. Water, rushing through carved stone channels, echoed through the temple like a god's breath. Pilgrims, already disoriented by darkness and maze-like passages, would hear this deep rolling roar and feel it not only in their ears, but in their chests, their bones, their souls. The temple turned water into voice, stone into spirit. Some believe these sounds mimic the growl of the jaguar, the most sacred creature of the land. Inside the heart of the temple, a towering sculpture stood the Lanzon. Carved from a single granite monolith and rising nearly 15 feet high, it held a face that was both human and not. Fangs curled from its mouth. Hair flowed like snakes. Eyes gazed in all directions. It stood at the crossing of the temple's main. Axis, a point where the physical and spiritual world were believed to meet. Those who reached it did not merely visit a god. They stepped into the mind of the divine. The walls, the sound, the shadow, they all conspired to create a space where the senses could no longer be trusted, where logic blurred, where the soul became weightless. This was no ordinary house of worship. Chavan was a technology of transformation. It used architecture, water, sound, and illusion to break apart the ordinary self and in its place offer something unknown. Gods with many faces. To understand the gods of Chavan is to let go of categories. These deities were not sculpted for comfort or clarity. They were not sky fathers or earth mothers with predictable forms. They were puzzles, contradictions, wild fusions of the natural world. The most sacred figures in Chavan art bore jaguar fangs, serpent hair, and talons like eagles. Their limbs twisted with purpose, merging human arms with paws and wings. They were not meant to resemble the world, they were meant to disturb it. But this disturbance was not fear, it was awe. It was the recognition of a truth beyond human form. These gods, with their tangled features, embodied the Andean idea that life was not separate parts, but one vast current. Human and animal, earth and sky, body and dream, these were not opposites, but reflections. To wear the face of the jaguar was to accept power and mystery. To show the teeth of the serpent was to speak in riddles older than speech. Chavan's priests did not just describe these gods. They became them. Through ritual masks, costumes, and altered states, the high priests of the temple transformed during ceremonies. They wore headdresses shaped like feline jaws. They painted their faces with charcoal and ochre. Under the influence of sacred plants, they entered trance states. In these moments, they claimed to speak the words of the gods, to act as their voice and vessel. And for the pilgrims who watched, it was not theater, it was truth. The boundary between man and spirit disappeared. Even the art of Chavan followed this logic. Carvings on temple walls were designed to shift as you moved. A face seen from one angle looked feline, from another, human. The viewer was not a passive observer, but part of the transformation. Sacred images were puzzles the eyes had to solve, drawing the viewer into an active spiritual dialogue. These gods did not command obedience through force. They invited surrender through mystery. Their faces, never fully known, reminded worshippers that divinity was not something to be possessed, but approached with wonder. The gods of Chavin were not symbols of order. They were gateways to the unknowable, faith beyond borders. Unlike later empires, the people of Chavin never sought dominion through conquest. Their influence did not spread through armies, but through ideas. There were no borders, no flags, no kings issuing decrees. Instead, there was a thread, a sacred thread, that stretched from village to village, mountain to valley, woven by common belief. And it began with symbols across the Andes. Even in regions hundreds of miles from the temple, one can find carvings and artifacts bearing Chavin designs. Fanged deities, spirals, sacred eyes, all etched into pottery, woven into cloth, carved into stone. These symbols traveled like wind, carried by pilgrims, artists, and shamans. They weren't imposed, they were shared. The people who adopted Chavin beliefs did so not because they were forced to, but because they saw something powerful in the vision. In this way, Chavin became not just a place, but a pulse, a living rhythm that touched people far beyond its valley. Even without a single ruler, the Chavin culture connected the Andes through ritual and story. Sacred plants, especially the hallucinogenic San Pedro cactus, played a role in these shared ceremonies. The visions they brought of jaguar, spirits, and serpent gods were understood across regions, even where languages differed. The divine did not need translation. This spiritual network was stronger than any army. It created alliances not through trade or tribute, but through awe. In a land where terrain divided communities, where mountains could isolate one valley, from the next faith became the bridge. And that bridge was adorned with Chavin symbols, glowing in sacred fire. Carved in mountain stone. The Chavin worldview taught that the cosmos was layered and alive, that all things had spirit, that time was circular, and death a kind of passage, not an end. These ideas seeded themselves deep into the Andean mind, forming the roots of what would later become Inca religion. Long before Cusco rose, Chavin was already dreaming the dreams that would shape an empire. The making of pilgrims. No one stumbled upon Chavin by chance. To reach it, one had to climb. One had to leave the known behind. Pilgrims from distant valleys, farmers, weavers, warriors, seekers, set out on foot with only what they could carry. Their journey took days, sometimes weeks. Along the way, they crossed icy streams, steep ridges, and rain-slicked paths. But still they came. Why? Not for riches, not for power, but for something deeper. They came because they had heard the stories of a temple that breathed, of gods that changed your dreams, of a stone that could make you see your soul. When they arrived, they did not enter all at once. Ritual required cleansing, fasting, silence. They were led through dark corridors where light flickered and shadows danced. Sounds echoed strangely. The roar of water pulsed beneath their feet. Smells of burning herbs filled the air. Their senses, already worn from the journey, bent under the weight of sacred space. Some cried, some trembled, some saw visions they could never explain. And when they emerged changed, They did not carry gold or relics. They carried memory, a carved amulet, a story, a symbol scratched into a pot. And through these tokens, the spirit of Shaven traveled. A child in a far-off village might one day touch that amulet and feel something stir. A weaver might mimic its patterns and thread. A young shaman might dream of jaguar gods and know exactly where that dream began. In this way, Shaven became eternal. It lived not in conquest, but in pilgrimage. Not in rule, but in reverence. Each footstep taken toward it was a thread in the great tapestry of Andean spirit. And though time would one day bury its stones in moss and silence, the sound of its sacred thunder would echo on in hearts, in stories, in the quiet tremble of those who seek something greater than themselves. Chapter 3: Lines in the Desert. In the vast wind-blown silence of southern Peru, where the desert stretches without shade or shelter, lies one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. This is not a land of lush valleys or towering cities. It is a land of dust, of sun, of endless space. And yet, across this barren plain, messages were drawn, messages not scratched on walls or carved into stone, but etched into the very earth itself. These are the Nazca lines. They stretch across the desert floor like soft murmurs, lines that twist, curve, and intersect over miles of land. Some are straight as arrows, perfectly aligned with distant points on the horizon. Others form shapes, enormous birds with wings outstretched, spiders with legs splayed in balance, monkeys with curling tails, and flowers that bloom in stone. From the ground, these lines are hard to grasp. They seem like paths or faint trails. But seen from above, from a height no Nazca person ever reached, they become clear, like ink on parchment, like signals sent skyward. The people who made these drawings lived between 500 BCE and 500 CE. They had no cranes or drones, no way to see their full work from the sky. And still, they managed to design massive figures, some as long as a football field, with near-perfect proportion. They made them by removing the dark pebbles that coated the desert surface, revealing the lighter earth below. In a place where there is almost no rain, the designs remained untouched by time. They were carved not with tools, but with intention, with a deep, careful respect for the land. Why did they do it? That is the mystery. These were not roads. They were not fences or fields. They served no daily need. Instead, they seemed to belong to another kind of purpose, something spiritual, something eternal. Perhaps they were made for the gods above, who could see what people could not. Or perhaps they were messages, prayers, or maps of the heavens, meant to bring order to the chaos of the world. To walk among the lines is to feel both small and connected. The air is still, the sky stretches wide, and beneath your feet, someone once walked carefully, purposefully, carving not for power, but for presence, for meaning in the middle of nowhere. This desert, once thought empty, became a canvas, not of brush or ink, but of stone and wind. And the art that remains is a message still waiting to be fully heard. Art as astronomy, the desert sky has no ceiling. On clear nights, the stars burn cold and close. The Nazca people looked upward and saw patterns, constellations that told time, guided planting, and marked sacred moments. Some believe that the great lines drawn on the ground mirrored the paths of stars. A bird-shaped figure might point toward the rising of a particular star at solstice. A long straight line might mark the place where the sun touches the edge of the mountains on the longest day of the year. To these people, the sky was not a separate world. It was a partner, a teacher, and they listened with care. By carving into the earth below, they may have been creating a reflection, a mirror to match the heavens. In this way, their geoglyphs became more than art. They became instruments, helping them understand the passage of time, the shift of seasons, the rhythm of the world. Some scholars suggest the lines were also ceremonial pathways. On certain days, when a star reached a point in the sky, the people may have walked the lines in ritual procession. Their steps would follow the shape of a hummingbird or spiral through the pattern of a flower, echoing the motion of the stars above. These walks were not random. They were sacred journeys, moments when earth and sky came into balance. Others believe the lines may have pointed toward water sources, rare and precious in the dry desert. The stars might have helped map these places, and the geoglyphs marked them. In this way, the Nazca joined heaven and earth in survival and celebration. Their art was not separate from their science. Their rituals were not apart from their environment. They were woven together like thread through cloth. What remains today is a quiet witness to their cosmic thinking. The lines are still precise, still pointing, still waiting. And though the full meaning may never be known, the care with which they were made speaks clearly. These were not random scratches in the soil. They were choices, alignments, symbols of a people who saw no gap between the sky above and the life they lived below. Desert ceremonies, though. The desert has swallowed much of the Nazca world. It has not hidden everything. Traces of ceremony still rest on the sand. Near some of the great geoglyphs, archaeologists have found pieces of pottery broken, colored, and placed with intention. Bits of cloth, twisted ropes, and wooden posts lie buried near the edges of certain shapes. These were not accidents. They were offerings. Some of the lines lead to small mounds or platforms made of stone. These spots may have served as altars places, where priests stood, where fires were lit, or where prayers were spoken aloud under open skies. Picture a procession at dusk. A line of people walking quietly, holding small candles or bowls of burning herbs. Their feet step gently along a spider's leg or a monkey's tail. Wind rustles their robes. The sky deepens with stars. And all around is silence, only the soft whisper of sand. Perhaps the people chanted. Perhaps they played flutes made of bone or beat slow rhythms on hollow drums. Each sound would rise and fade in the open air, carried by the breeze, blending with the land. The desert, so often seen as empty, became full of meaning, movement, and presence. The lines were not just images. They were paths. They were rituals walked into being. Some believe the ceremonies were linked to water. In a place so dry, water was more than a need, it was a miracle. The lines may have honored the mountain gods, the sky spirits, or the ancestors who could bless the land with rain. Offerings might have included corn, coca leaves, feathers, or animal remains given in hope, in thanks, or in longing. Even today, some local traditions remember these sacred steps. In festivals held near Nazca towns, dancers retrace the shapes of old. Music fills the air. Hands rise in rhythm. Though the meanings have changed, the spirit of connection remains. The lines, once walked by priests, now echo beneath the feet of farmers and children. In the desert, time stretches thin. but ceremony leaves a trace. In every shard of pottery, in every careful line drawn across the sand, we glimpse a people who met the harshness of life not with fear, but with devotion. With rhythm and with grace. Beauty and silence beyond the great lines, the Nazca left another gift, smaller, more delicate, but no less rich. Their pottery, found in graves and hidden caches, shows another side of their spirit. While the desert spoke in vast shapes, their hands shaped clay into cups, jars, and bowls covered in life. Birds with curling feathers, jaguars in mid-leap, mythical beings with wild eyes and flowing hair. Each figure, painted in warm, earthy tones, feels alive. These pieces were not rushed. The brushstrokes are careful, the shapes smooth and balanced. The colors, reds, browns, creams, and blacks, were drawn from the minerals of the land. Even in a place of sun and dryness, the Nazca found softness. Their art is not loud, it is not crowded. It breathes like the wind. It holds space like the desert itself. Some pieces show scenes of daily life, farming, fishing, weaving. Others show dreams, creatures with human arms and animal faces, gods with tongues of flame or wings made of smoke. The Nazca saw no hard line between the world of waking and the world of spirit. Both were real. Both belonged in color and form. Their textiles, though few survive, tell the same story. Threads woven so tightly they resist decay. Patterns that ripple like water or echo the spirals seen in the desert lines. Women, likely working by firelight, wove stories into cloth, each stitch a quiet prayer, each color a breath of beauty. The Nazca were not builders of empires. They left no massive walls or towers, but what they left instead was a gentler legacy, a kind of beauty that listens more than it speaks. In the harshest land, they chose art. In the face of silence, they painted songs. And though the wind still moves across their empty plains, the lines remain. The pots remain. The spirit remains. In this desert of heat and light, the Nazca drew messages that cannot be erased. Not because they shouted, but because they listened to the stars, to the earth, and to the quiet voice within. Chapter 4. Lords of the North Coast. In the northern valleys of ancient Peru, where riverbeds slice through sun-baked plains and the air tastes of salt and dust, a civilization once flourished that knew how to see the soul. The Mocha left no written script. They did not carve long tales in stone or chisel records of kings. Instead, they shaped their stories in clay faces of real people, frozen in expressions that still speak today. These were not simple pots or vague figures. Mocha ceramics are portrait sculpted heads so precise that each wrinkle, scar, and furrowed brow feels as if it were captured from life. The lips part slightly, the eyes meet yours, and for a moment it seems they might breathe. They were molded with such care that historians today can identify recurring individuals, suggesting a visual language of power and memory passed from hand to hand. These ceramic portraits were made using a method called stirrup spout vessels, an elegant form that allowed the pieces to hold water or ceremonial liquids. Yet what they held most was presence. Some faces laugh, others grimace. Some wear the headdresses of warriors or high priests. Some appear wounded, humbled, or old. It was not perfection they sought, it was truth. Through fire and clay, the Mocha captured the essence of the human experience: joy, fear, pride, age, and the weight of status. These portraits were more than art. They were mirrors, not for vanity, but for memory. In a world without books or scrolls, these faces told who mattered. They honored leaders, warriors, priests, and perhaps even enemies. They were kept in tombs, placed near the dead as companions on the journey to the afterlife. In death, the Mocha believed one should not go alone. One should go with memory, with story, with face. And so, their legacy lives not in battles or cities remembered by name, but in the human face soft, cracked by time, but somehow still watching, still telling the story of a people who spoke. Through the silence of clay, the pyramid of the sun beneath the dry blue skies of the Moche heartland, where the sun bears down without mercy and the rivers run narrow between parched lands, the people raised something enormous, something both sacred and commanding. In the valley of Mocha, near the Pacific coast, rose the Huaca del Sol, the pyramid of the sun god built from over 130 million mud bricks. This colossal structure was not a simple building. It was a mountain shaped by human hands. At its peak, it once stood nearly 150 feet high. Its walls, stepped and rising, held the heat of the sun, glowing at dusk like amber. The bricks bore the fingerprints of their makers' workers from surrounding communities who each stamped their mark into clay before it was dried. In this way, the pyramid was both collective and personal, a shared monument to belief and effort. Huaca del Sol was not alone. Just nearby stood another great mound, the Huaca de la Luna, the Pyramid of the Moon. These two sacred sites faced each other across the desert as if in silent conversation. Between them stretched a ceremonial plaza where people gathered, watched, prayed, and feared. The pyramids were not simply places to worship, they were stages for the divine, centers of power where the gods and rulers met. Inside the temples, walls were once painted with scenes of myth and ceremony, lines of warriors, dancing gods, and priests in flowing garments. Platforms at the top were used for rituals and perhaps for watching the stars, reading the sky like a sacred scroll. Offerings were made here, and not only of grain or flowers. Blood was spilled, lives were given, and the crowd below, men, women, children, watched in reverent silence. These pyramids were the heart of Mocha power. They were not cities with walls or markets. They were spiritual machines alive with ceremony. They stood not just to impress, but to function. The people believed the gods needed attention. They needed worship. They needed sacrifice. The Huacas, these great sacred mounds, were the bridges that made such communion possible. And today, though eroded by time and storms, they still rise from the dust like memory made solid echoes of faith, power, and the longing to touch the sky. Ritual and sacrifice beneath the grace of Mocha art, a darker truth waits. For this was a world not only of beauty and architecture, but of blood. The Mocha believed that the balance of life required more than prayer. It required exchange. Ritual combat was a sacred act. Warriors fought not to conquer lands, but to prove worth. And the defeated were not punished. They were chosen. Captured warriors, often stripped of their weapons and dignity, were led to the ceremonial platforms of the Great Pyramids. They were not prisoners in chains, but offerings in flesh. The gods, it was believed, needed nourishment, not just through food or incense, but through life itself. The heart, the blood, the spirit, it was all part of a sacred cycle. Sacrifice. was not cruelty. It was communication. Painted scenes on Moche ceramics show this clearly. Warriors are shown tied, their throats cut in ritual fashion, their blood caught in shallow bowls. Priests, often women as well as men, lift the vessels toward the sky, presenting them to the gods. In some versions, a great figure watches the decapitator, a god of death and renewal, holding a severed head in one hand and a blade in the other. These rituals were not secret. They were public. Crowds gathered at the foot of the pyramids. They watched the steps stained red. They listened to the chants, the drums, the calls to the gods. This was a moment of unity, where the people, the priests, and the divine met in purpose. To the Moche, sacrifice was not failure, it was offering. It was proof that they were willing to give the most sacred thing they had, life, in return. For rain, for crops, for protection. These were people who lived in a world of sharp contrasts, lush valleys surrounded by desert, rivers that vanished without warning, droughts that could kill. To live, they believed, was to balance. And sometimes, balance meant blood. We look back now with mixed emotions. But in their eyes, this was not savagery, it was survival. A ritual performed not in cruelty, but in hope that the gods would listen, that the skies would open, that life would continue. Beneath the mask, for all their strength, for all the bold lines in their art and the towering forms of their temples, the Moche lived in a world of deep uncertainty. Their valleys bloomed only when the rivers ran. Their crops grew only when the rains arrived. The balance of their lives hung not on kings or armies, but on the sky, and the sky could be silent. Behind the fierce faces carved in ceramic behind the warriors, the gods, the snarling beasts, there was a quiet thread of fear. The fear that perhaps the rituals were not enough, that perhaps the gods had turned away. Some pieces of Moche art reveal this tension. Faces that once laughed now grimace. Eyes look wide with doubt. The lines of power begin to crack. Droughts came. So did floods. Evidence of sudden climate shifts, possibly from El Niño events, has been found in the layers of their architecture and the scars in their fields. Crops failed. Ceremonial centers were abandoned. And slowly, the power of the Moche began to wane. The people tried to hold it all together. They built more temples. They painted more prayers. They sacrificed more. But the silence grew. The rivers did not always return. And the gods, it seemed, had become distant. Yet even in this unraveling, the Moche left behind beauty. They did not stop creating. They did not stop trying to speak. Their final pieces are no less powerful than the first, perhaps even more so. They show us what it means to believe with all your heart in something greater, even as that belief begins to slip away. And so, the Moche remind us of something deeply human, that the greatest art often comes not from certainty, but from struggle. That faith is not the absence of fear, but the courage to create, to hope, to give, even when the outcome is unknown. Their temples may crumble, their gods may fall silent, but their voices remain in clay, in paint, in silence that still stirs. The Desert Wind. Chapter 5. Lake of the Ancestors. In the high plains of the Andes, where the wind moves like a whisper through time and the light touches the land with a sacred stillness, stands a place older than legend. Near the deep blue waters of Lake Titicaca. Lake as wide as the sky and as cold as memory rises the ancient city of Tiwanaku. And in its heart, carved from stone, are faces that watch. These are not ordinary statues. They do not shout for attention or boast of conquests. They stand in quiet dignity, worn smooth by centuries of sun, frost, and silence. Some are tall and slender, their surfaces carved with geometric patterns and hands folded at their chests. Others wear crowns of step design, their eyes large and deep, their mouths drawn and calm. The greatest of them, known as the Ponce monolith, rises more than twice the height of a man, holding a ceremonial cup in one hand and a staff in the other. He does not move. He does not speak, but he sees. These monoliths are memory made into matter. They were placed not for beauty alone, but to mark power, prayer, and presence. They face the sun, the stars, and the sacred mountains. They stood before temples and altars. They were part of the ritual witnesses to chants and dances, to offerings and flame. Some believe they were ancestors, spirits frozen in stone to remind the living of their place in the great circle of life. Others think they were gods or messengers between worlds. Whatever they were, they endured. The stones of Tiwanaku do not tell their story in words. They tell it in silence, in shadow, in shape. Their angles are sharp, their design intentional. Everything here points somewhere toward the horizon, toward the stars, toward something beyond the visible. And in this way, Tiwanaku does not feel like a ruin. It feels like a memory still alive. A place where the past has not ended, but simply paused, waiting for someone to look closely enough to remember. Water made sacred at these heights. Where the air is thin and frost can come even in summer, survival is not easy. Yet the people of Tiwanaku thrived. They did so not by fighting nature, but by listening to it, by shaping water not just as a tool, but as a sacred companion. In this land of extremes, they became masters of water. They built canals that did not simply carry water, but arranged it. These canals reflected the stars at night, turning dark still pools into mirrors of the sky. Some channels were aligned with solstices and equinoxes, turning fields into calendars. Others were designed to flow in harmony with sacred directions north, south, east, and west, making the movement of water a ceremony in itself. Even more impressive were the raised fields called sukacalas. These were long, wide mounds of soil lifted above flood-prone ground, separated by narrow canals. During the day, the canals absorbed sunlight. At night, they released heat, protecting the crops from frost. This sacred technology created a microclimate, allowing food to grow where it otherwise would wither. Potatoes, quinoa, and maize rose from the earth, nourished by care and design. The fields were alive, not just with plants, but with spirit. For the people of Tiwanaku, water was not just survival, it was presence. It carried blessings, connected places, and guided souls. Ceremonies were held along its edges. Offerings were floated on its surface. Some canals even led to the lake itself, as if to return to the source, to complete a sacred circle. Lake Titicaca, vast and deep, was more than a lake. It was the navel of the world, the place where life began. In later times, the Inca would say their ancestors emerged from its waters. But even before them, the people of Tiwanaku saw the lake not just as geography, but as memory, a mirror of the heavens, and a gateway to the unseen. Through their work with water, They transformed the harshness of the highlands into abundance. And in doing so, they showed that mastery of land is not about domination, but about devotion. It was not just farming. It was prayer. Trade as empire. The greatness of Tiwanaku was not built with armies. It did not grow through force. Instead, it expanded like a breath, gently, steadily, filling space with meaning. This was not an empire of walls or swords. It was an empire of trust, of exchange, of spirit. Goods flowed in and out of Tiwanaku, like streams feeding a lake. Llamas carried woven cloth, colorful feathers, and ceramic vessels across high passes. From the lowlands came tropical fruits. From the coast came seashells and fish. From distant valleys came obsidian, gold, and copper. But more than goods, what moved was story, belief, art, and memory carried from place to place. At its height, Tiwanaku's reach spanned hundreds of miles. Yet there are no signs of conquest. No burned cities, no chains. What held it together was reciprocity, the Andean ideal of aini, or mutual exchange. Communities gave and received. Rituals were shared. Symbols traveled, painted and carved into temples and textiles alike. People did not submit. They participated. Pilgrims came to Tiwanaku not out of fear, but out of reverence. They came for festivals, for rituals, for trade. They returned home, carrying icons, customs, and stories. And with them, Tiwanaku's vision spread not as command, but as inspiration. Even the city itself reflected this openness. Its layout was not rigid or militarized. It was ceremonial, spiritual. There were plazas, temples, and platform spaces for gathering, speaking, offering. The central sunken courtyard, ringed by monoliths, may have been a space of initiation. The gateway of the sun, carved with intricate deities and patterns, faced the dawn. It stood not as a wall, but as an opening and invitation to step through into something greater. Through these gestures, Tiwanaku became a spiritual empire. It wove a net not of power, but of meaning. And that net held strong not through fear, but through faith. The legacy of stone today, Tiwanaku lies in quiet ruin. Its temples are broken, its carvings are worn, its canals are dry, but even in silence it speaks. And what it whispers has never truly faded. The Inca, who rose centuries later, never forgot Tiwanaku. They called it sacred. They sent priests to study its stones. They copied its designs, the trapezoidal doorways, the stepped motifs, the use of cosmic alignment. Even the Inca belief that their ancestors came from Lake Titicaca echoes Tiwanaku's sacred view of the lake. Tiwanaku's vision lives on in how the Andes think and feel. Its sense of sacred direction, of the land as alive, of ritual as structure. These ideas became the backbone of later Andean civilization. And even now, local communities remember. They hold festivals near the ruins. They tell stories of the stones. They speak of the spirits who still dwell in the old places. Archaeologists walk its grounds, measuring and mapping. But the deepest truths of Tiwanaku cannot be measured. They are in the air, in the way the sunlight touches the gateway of the sun, in the echo of footsteps through sacred plazas, in the way the lake reflects the sky just as it did 1,000 years ago. Tiwanaku reminds us that greatness is not always loud. It is not always built in haste or maintained by war. Sometimes Greatness is in the stillness, in the slow work of carving a stone, in the careful shaping of water, in the quiet promise that even if people vanish, their vision can remain. And so Tiwanaku endures not just in stone, but in soul, in the hearts of those who walk its paths, in the echo of the ancestors who shaped the land, shaped the sky, and shaped a story too large for any one age to hold. Chapter 6. Warriors and Windroads. High in the Andean highlands, where fog rolled across stone like drifting memory and valleys carved deep scars into the earth, a new kind of order quietly emerged. It did not shout with gold or glitter with temples. It whispered in straight lines, square rooms, and silent walls. This was the world of the Wari. They did not build their cities to impress the gods, but to shape the people. From the arid plateaus of Ayacucho to the slopes near Cusco, the Wari stamped their presence into the land with a precision that felt almost mathematical. Their cities, places like Piquilacta, were laid out like grids, strict and unwavering. Streets met at right angles. Blocks were divided into uniform compounds. Every wall, every gate, every step was designed to fit a pattern. These were not cities of spontaneous joy or colorful sprawl. They were statements of power. Walls wrapped around neighborhoods like silent guards. Avenues cut straight through open space as if nature itself had been told to follow instructions. There were no grand plazas filled with dancing crowds only. Courtyards made for efficiency, for watching, for control. In this world of stone and symmetry, people move through space not with freedom, but with purpose. Paths led not wherever the feet wandered, but exactly where they were told to go. The very design of the city was a kind of law, a quiet, unshakable law made from brick and distance. Why such control? Perhaps the Wari saw what others missed, that chaos was always waiting. The Andes, beautiful and brutal, offered no guarantees. Crops could fail, droughts could come, people could scatter. And so, the Wari built not just cities, but systems. Spaces that could hold the unpredictable, contain it, and guide it. Their cities were not just homes. They were tools. Tools for keeping order, for managing movement, for teaching the eye, the body, and the mind what it meant to belong to something larger than yourself. The art of control for the Wari was not loud. It didn't always need soldiers or battles. Often, it came softly painted into pots, repeated in rooftops, baked into the very bricks of daily life. To understand Wari power, one must look at their art, or rather, their patterns. Wari pottery, spread across the mountains and valleys, follows a narrow rhythm. Geometric shapes, repeated colors, familiar forms. Wherever one traveled, the style remained constant. This was not coincidence. It was design. The Wari created a visual language that tied people together, not by force, but by familiarity. A pot in one town looked like a pot in another. A wall in the north echoed a wall in the south. People knew what to expect. And in that sameness, they learned what it meant to be part of the Wari world. Architecture followed the same code. Buildings were nearly identical. Rooms arranged with the same shapes, the same measurements. Even the doorways seemed to repeat a message. You are part of a structure, and that structure does not bend. This was a different kind of power, one that worked quietly, one that entered daily life and stayed there. It didn't just rule it, shaped. It told people how to build, how to move, how to live. The Wari were not concerned with artistic flair. They did not seek beauty for beauty's sake. Their art served a greater goal: stability, control, unity. Even textiles, woven in fine threads by skilled hands, carried this message. Repeating motifs, symmetrical designs, icons of authority stitched into cloth that wrapped around leaders and messengers. What the eyes saw, the mind absorbed. Over time, repetition became truth. The Wari taught with patterns, not through punishment, but through design. They governed not only with rules, but with rhythm. And in that rhythm, they built a society where everyone moved together, even if they did not fully understand the steps, a thread through the mountains. Among the Wari's most lasting gifts was something both simple and sacred: a road, or rather, many roads. Thin lines of stone and earth, winding across the vast Andean landscape, connecting places once thought separate. These were not wide highways, but footpaths, steep, narrow, and precise. And they changed everything. Before the Wari, the highlands were a patchwork of scattered settlements. Valleys spoke different languages. Mountains divided people more than they connected them. But the Wari saw opportunity in movement. Roads became the veins of their civilization, carrying not just goods, but thought, ritual, and reach. These early networks linked fields to towns, towns to sacred sites, and sacred sites to ceremonial centers. Goods moved faster. Ideas moved farther. Messengers could travel for days without losing their way. Rest stops called tambos were placed along the routes, offering shelter and storage. Even the landscape was shaped to serve the road. Paths were carved into cliffs. Bridges were built from woven fibers across canyons. The road was not just built, it was believed in. These roads did more than connect, they unified. A pot style could now travel hundreds of miles. A textile pattern could show up in distant regions. Ceremonies could happen in sync. The Wari used roads to create a shared world, even across harsh terrain. And though their roads were eventually forgotten, their idea was not. Centuries later, the Inca would take this thread and spin it into something greater. They would stretch their highways for thousands of miles, connecting jungles, deserts, and mountains. But it began here, with the Wari, with a belief that the road is more than a path. It is a promise. A promise that even in the tallest mountains, people can meet. That even in silence, something can move. Lessons for the future. The Wari did not last forever. Their cities faded. Their names grew quiet. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps it was drought. Perhaps disease. Perhaps the very systems they built could not hold forever. The rhythms broke. The roads cracked, and the grids returned to dust, but their ideas did not die. In the centuries that followed, new powers rose, the Inca among them. And when they built their empire, they did not begin from nothing. They looked back. They listened to the ground, and in the soil they found the Wari. They found the straight streets, the modular walls, the vision of unity through repetition. They found the remains of roads and built them wider. They found the echoes of control and gave them form. Even the idea of storing food in state warehouses, of sending runners with messages, of shaping the land with intent. All this the Inca inherited. To walk the streets of Cusco is to walk the legacy of the Wari. To follow the great Inca highways is to follow a dream first dreamed centuries before. The Wari may be gone, but they are not lost. Their lessons live in stone, in silence, in the shape of things that endure. They remind us that the greatest empires do not always rise with war cries. Sometimes they begin with a wall, a thread, a step taken in rhythm. And though time may bury their names, their patterns remain. In the quiet breath of the Andes, the Wari still speak. Not with voice, but with design. Not with story, but with structure. They teach us that order is not the end of creativity, but its beginning. That control, when made with care, can hold a world together. At least for a while. And so we remember the Wari not just as rulers, but as rhythm makers, as people who shape stone, and in doing so, shape time. Chapter 7. The Valley of Beginnings. In the high places where the Andes stretch their long fingers toward the heavens, where clouds drift low and the wind carries whispers older than language, the Inca told stories of their birth. These were not just legends, they were origins wrapped in mystery and meaning, shaped to explain who they were and why they had come. One tale begins at a cave, a place called Pacaritambo. From its dark mouth stepped the first ancestors, children of the earth and sky. They were 4 brothers and 4 sisters, divine siblings sent to bring order to a scattered world. In their hands they held a golden staff gifted by the sun himself, and with it, they wandered, searching for the place that would sink into the earth. That place, they were told, would be home. A land chosen not by power, but by the will of the gods. Another story rose from the shimmering waters of Lake Titicaca, where the sunlight dances on the waves like fire turned liquid. From this sacred lake, the sun sent his son and daughter to the world, Manco Capac and Mama Aclo. They emerged not as conquerors, but as teachers, clothed in gold and purpose. Their task was simple, yet great: to civilize the people of the earth, to guide them from chaos to culture. Though these stories differed in detail, they shared a single truth. The Inca believed they came from somewhere sacred. They were not born in battle. They did not rise from soil soaked in blood. They stepped out of legend, out of light and cave and lake, guided by symbols and sky. Their origin was not earthly, but cosmic. These stories were told beside fires, passed from elders to children. They were carved into stone, woven into cloth, and sung under stars. And in every version, the message was clear. The Inca were chosen, not by chance, but by design. They walked the earth with purpose, and the world would one day know their name. Manco Capac and Mama Aclo, at the heart of the Inca's creation stories, stood 2 figures, Manco Capac and Mama Aclo, brother and sister, husband and wife, sun-born and lake-born. Together, they were the beginning not only of a people, but of a path. They did not rule through might. They did not build palaces or lead armies. Instead, they taught. Manco Capac showed men how to till the soil, how to coax life from the dry ground. He planted not just crops, but discipline. He taught the ways of worship, of fire, of law. Mama Aclo walked with the women, showing them how to weave, how to gather, how to build a home that would hold the future. She spun threads into fabric, but also into memory stories that held the past and pointed toward the unknown. Together, they carried the golden staff, a sacred rod that would guide their journey. Wherever they pressed it into the earth, the land rejected it until one day, in a quiet valley ringed by mountains, the staff sank softly, as if the earth itself had opened to receive it. There, in the heart of the Andes, they stopped. That place was Cusco. They did not declare it with trumpets. There were no towers, no stone walls. Just a valley kissed by the sun, embraced by rivers, and blessed by sky. But they knew this was not land chosen by accident. It was selected by the will of heaven. And so they began, not with armies, but with teachings. Not with conquest, but with care. In the stories passed down through generations, Manco Capac and Mama Aklo are remembered not just as founders, but as symbols. Symbols of balance, male and female, strength and wisdom, land and spirit. They remind us that the greatest empires are not always built by force, but by the patient shaping of life. Cusco before the empire, before Cusco became the navel of the world, before gold lined its temples and kings walked its streets, it was something quieter. It was a valley, a cradle of earth and water where life moved in soft rhythms, where people rose with the sun, tended to the herds, and watched the stars. The land was rich, not with treasure, but with balance. Rivers wound through fields of maize. Llamas grazed on distant slopes. Potatoes grew in layers, each variety chosen for altitude and air. The people here were farmers, builders, dreamers. They looked to the mountains not just for protection, but for presence. Every peak had a name. Every shadow meant something. Time was marked by the sun, and the sun was more than light, it was life. Villages were small, built of stone and thatch. Homes faced the sun, and their doorways welcomed the wind. Children played near streams. Elders sat in the fading light, sharing stories of ancestors and gods. There were no palaces, no walls of power. But there was something deeper, a sense that this place was waiting to become. The people of Cusco were not alone. Around them, other groups lived and thrived, each with their own traditions, their own ways of honoring the land. Some lived higher in the mountains, others closer to the jungle's edge. There was no single ruler, no clear center. But there was motion. There was exchange. There was something beginning. In time, leaders would emerge. Conflicts would shape borders. Alliances would be formed in marriage and war. But in these early days, Cusco was not yet an empire. It was a seed, a quiet gathering of people, living in harmony with sky and soil, carrying stories of where they came from and dreams of where they might go. The inheritance of the ancients, the Inca did not build their world from empty space. They stood on shoulders. They walked in footprints left long before their time, and they knew it. They did not claim invention. They claimed inheritance. In their tents, temples, one can see the geometry of Tiwanaku, the bold angles, the celestial alignments, the sacred respect for stone. In their cities, one can feel the influence of the wari, the layout, the infrastructure, the road that does not wander but leads. In their art, one glimpses the visions of the mochu, the painted lines, the fierce faces, the rhythm of ritual. Even in the delicate patterns of their textiles, echoes of Nazca dreams can be found. The early Inca gathered these fragments not as collectors, but as gardeners. They took what survived and planted it anew. They learned from what had failed. They honored what had endured. And in doing so, they did not simply repeat history, they refined it. They learned to build terraces that clung to mountains like stairs to the sky. They learned to move water with grace, feeding fields with quiet streams. They learned to organize labor, to count with knotted cords, to tell time by the stars. Each lesson came from someone before. Each method carried a memory. But what the Inca added was something of their own. A vision not just of survival, but of unity. A belief that all the pieces could come together. That the highlands and the coast, the jungle and the desert, the past and the present, could all be woven into one great fabric. Like threads in a tapestry, different in color, but joined in pattern. Their greatness came not from being first, but from remembering. And in that remembering, they created something new. Something that would grow, climb, and eventually stretch across mountains and time. And it all began here. In a quiet valley, in stories told by firelight, in footsteps pressed into soft soil, a beginning shaped not by conquest, but by listening. Listening to the land, to the sky, and to the ancestors who still whispered in the wind. Chapter 8: The Making of an Empire. There are moments in history that feel like the turning of a page. Quiet at first, uncertain, and then sudden like the hush before a storm. In the shadowed valleys surrounding Cusco, such a moment came with the distant sound of war drums. The Chanca had arrived. They were fierce warriors, born of highlands and hardship, and they marched with purpose. The Chanca had set their sights on Cusco, the quiet city nestled between the sacred peaks. To them, it was ripe for conquest. News of their advance spread quickly. Panic rippled through the streets. The air was tight with fear. King Viracocha, old and uncertain, made a choice. He fled. Alongside him, his chosen heir vanished into the hills, leaving the city open, vulnerable, exposed. But not all had left. One son remained. He was not the favorite. He had no title, no great command. But his name was Cusiupanqui. And as the dust rose on the horizon, something shifted within him. A spark caught flame. While others prepared to surrender or run, he looked to the city not with dread, but with resolve. This was not only a fight for survival. It was the beginning of something greater. Cusiupanqui rallied those who stayed. He gathered the old, the young, the forgotten. He inspired them not with promises, but with presence. They fortified the walls. They sharpened stone weapons. They watched the mountain passes like hawks. And when the Chanca came, expecting an easy victory, they were met not with submission, but with resistance. What followed was not just a battle, it was a statement. The Chanca, fierce and many, could not break the will of a city guided by vision. By the end, the enemy fled, leaving behind their wounded pride and shattered belief. The city had held, and the boy who stayed? He was no longer just a son. He was a leader, a warrior, a seed of something the Andes had never seen before. From the ashes of fear, an empire would rise. Pachacati, the world shaper victory, did not make Cusiupanqui content. It awakened something deeper. After the defense of Cusco, he took a new name, Pachacati. It meant he who turns the earth. And that is what he intended to do. Pachacati was more than a warrior. He was a visionary. He saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. In his eyes, the Inca were not just one tribe among many, they were destined to unite the Andes, not by erasing differences, but by shaping them into a single pattern. Like threads in a woven cloth, he began to reshape the very idea of power. Where others ruled through fear, he ruled through design. Where others demanded tribute, he built structure. His mind reached into myth, into history, into the unseen. The Inca were not only people of the mountains, they were chosen by the sun, children of heaven and stone. Under Pachacati, this belief was no longer just story. It became identity. It became law. He crafted the foundations of an empire that would stretch farther than any before it in the Americas. He created the idea of Tawantinsuyu, the 4 quarters of the world, each part bound to the center, each ruled by harmony. But harmony, he knew, required structure. And structure he built. Pachacati created laws. He shaped administration. He planted officials like seeds across the valleys, each responsible for counting, for guiding, for gathering. He built the Inca into something larger than conquest. He turned them into a system, a living, breathing force of rhythm and control. But, perhaps most of all, Pachacati understood memory. He ordered stories to be kept, histories to be told through quipu, the knotted cords that captured time. He called forth architects, builders, priests, and planners. His empire would not fade like smoke. It would endure, written not in paper, but in stone, road, and ritual. Rebuilding Cusco, the city that had once braced for defeat, now became the center of the world. Under Pachacuti's gaze, Cusco was no longer just a town in a valley. It was the axis, the center from which all things would flow. He did not preserve the old walls. He tore them down. Not out of anger, but out of vision. Cusco would be remade. Not as memory, but as message. He shaped the city like a sacred puma, its body spread across the land. Its heart beating at the temple of the sun Coricancha. Coricancha became the most sacred site in the Inca world. Its walls were lined with gold, sheets so brilliant they reflected the sun itself. Inside, altars were placed with precision. Statues of gods and ancestors stood watch. Gardens of silver and gold plants shimmered in the temple's light. This was not just a temple, it was a declaration. Here, the divine and the earthly met. Streets flowed outward from Coricancha in perfect lines. Buildings rose with stones so well fitted that no blade could pass between them. These were not homes of mortar and guesswork. They were sculptures of purpose, each wall angled to withstand earthquakes. Each door carved in trapezoid to stand firm against the sky. It was engineering as poetry. And within this sacred puma of a city, people moved in harmony. Farmers brought offerings. Priests watched the stars. Artisans shaped tools and textiles. It was a city alive not with noise, but with intention. Every inch spoke of balance between heaven and earth, between ruler and ruled, between past and future. In Cusco, Pachacati created more than stone. He created symbol. And from that symbol, the empire drew its strength. Roads to everywhere an empire. No matter how inspired, cannot breathe without connection. Pachacati knew this. And so, he turned to the land itself, not to conquer it with walls, but to stitch it together with roads. He and his engineers carved paths through the Andes. These were not simple trails, but highways of ambition. Called the Capacona, royal roads stretched across deserts, jungles, cliffs, and high peaks. Over 25,000 miles of roads spanned the empire, an astonishing web of stone, dirt, and determination. Some routes hugged the coast. Others climbed into the clouds. Rope bridges swayed over deep canyons. Tunnels pierced through mountainsides. Steps were carved into the very bones of the earth. These roads were not obstacles. They were arteries pumping people, food, soldiers, and ideas from the heart of Cusco to the furthest edges of the realm. Along the way stood tambos, resting stations stocked with food, water, and shelter. Messengers, called chasqui, ran in relays, carrying news and orders at speeds that defied the rugged land. A runner in the south could send word to the capital in just days. The voice of the emperor could travel faster than wind. The roads were sacred. They were swept, maintained, protected. Travelers offered coca leaves and prayers before setting foot upon them. They connected not just places, but people. A potter in the north could feel part of the same world as a herder in the south. A temple in the jungle could echo the rituals of one in the mountains. These roads brought the Inca world to life. And though centuries have passed, many still remain. Their stones still feel the weight of footsteps. Their bridges still sway in the wind. And in their silence, they still whisper the story of Pachacati, the world shaper, the road builder, the man who turned a tribe into an empire. Chapter 9. The Land of Four Quarters. From the sacred center of Cusco, a vision unfolded. Not just a city, not just a kingdom, but a design, a shape of power. A body drawn across mountains and valleys, woven into forests and deserts. This was Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. It was more than a name. It was a way of seeing the world. Four directions. Four Siu, four limbs of an empire with Cusco as its beating heart. From this sacred navel, lines extended outward like sun rays, north, south, east, and west. Each path led to a Siu, a region with its own people, its own seasons, its own soul. To the northwest was Chinchesiu, coastal, lush, and far-reaching. Here lived fishermen, traders, and cities shaped by sea breezes. To the northeast, Antisuyu, wild and green, reaching into the edge of the Amazon. To the southeast, Calasuyu, vast and cool, stretching into the highlands of today's Bolivia and Chile. And to the southwest, Contasuyu, where the dry winds brushed the desert and sky. These were not arbitrary boundaries. They were sacred geometry. Each Siu was a part of the whole, like the limbs of a great being. Each moved in rhythm with the others. Together, they made up Tawantinsuyu, translated simply as the four parts together. In the Andean mind, this was not just territory, it was cosmos. Mountains were not just rock. Rivers were not just water. Everything was alive and everything had a place. By mapping the empire in this way, the Inca did more than organize space. They placed the world in balance. Every subject knew their Siu. They knew the road that tied them to Cusco. They knew that somewhere, far beyond the hills, other Siu stirred under the same sun. They were many but one, separated by stone but joined in spirit. And though the land changed from salt flats to rainforests, from cliffs to plains, the lines held. The pattern endured. For the Inca, power was not only a matter of rule, it was a matter of alignment. A matter of placing people, places, and purpose into harmony. Diplomacy and force. The Inca did not always arrive with war. They preferred to arrive with invitation. When scouts spotted a distant village or a powerful rival chief, messengers were sent, not with threats, but with gifts. Fine textiles, coca leaves, gold ornaments. Alongside them came words of peace. Join us, they said, and you will keep your land. You will keep your gods, you will keep your name. But you will be part of something greater. Sometimes the offer was accepted. Local leaders became curakas, administrators in the service of the empire. Sons were sent to Cusco to learn the Inca language and customs. Marriages were arranged between noble houses. Ceremonies were held. And without a single weapon drawn, a new people joined the rhythm of Tawantinsuyu, but not everyone agreed. When diplomacy failed, the armies marched. And they did not march slowly. Inca warriors moved fast, supplied by storehouses along their roads, guided by runners and scouts. Their formations were tight, their discipline unmatched. Their weapon slings, clubs and bronze-tipped spears were deadly in motion. The Inca did not destroy for pleasure. They conquered for purpose. A village that resisted might see its leaders replaced, its people relocated, its structures rebuilt. Resistance was not just broken, it was absorbed. But even in conquest, the Inca were not careless. They studied the people they met. They took note of local gods, of farming techniques, of songs and symbols. And rather than erasing, they adapted. Those who resisted might find their world shattered. But once peace returned, something remarkable happened. They were rebuilt not as enemies, but as partners. Conquest for the Inca was never only about land. It was about transformation. It was about turning chaos into order, scattering into unity. Whether through peaceful gifts or sharp spears, the goal was the same: to bring all voices into one great song. Architecture of order. As the Inca moved outward, stone followed behind them. In every corner of the empire, new structures rose, not wild or improvised, but deliberate, precise. These were more than buildings. They were signatures of rule. They marked the presence of the state, the order of the Sapa Inca. Fortresses appeared. On mountain ridges, towers of smooth stone that stood like watchful eyes. Administrative centers sprang up in valleys, with courtyards and storage rooms built in quiet symmetry. These were not built for beauty, though they often were beautiful. They were built to last, to speak, to say, "We are here." Walls were made with no mortar. Blocks shaped to fit one another so perfectly, even time could not pry them apart. Doorways followed the sacred trapezoid. Roofs sloped in careful measure, ready for sun, wind, and rain. From the highlands of Ecuador to the deserts of northern Chile, the same shapes returned, the same patterns repeated. Like a single language spoken across 1,000 landscapes, these structures became centers of coordination. Here, taxes were collected, not in coins, but in maize, textiles, and labor. Here, census records were kept with knotted quipu. Here, officials gathered to count, to plan, to speak in the name of the Sapa Inca, but they were also places of welcome. Travelers found shelter. Farmers brought offerings. Rituals were held in open plazas. The state was not far away, it stood right before them, in stone and shadow. Each new site was a bridge, a link between the local and the imperial, between the known and the vast. In building these centers, the Inca did not just expand. They connected. They tied places to each other. They made space into system. In time, these buildings would shape how people thought, how they moved, how they lived. They were not monuments to the past. They were tools for the future. Unity through diversity, perhaps? The greatest achievement of the Inca was not their roads or their stonework, but their understanding of people. They knew the Andes were not empty. They were full of voices, colors, rhythms, and beliefs. And instead of silencing them, the Inca listened. When a village joined the empire, its traditions were not discarded. Local festivals continued. Local gods remained in their shrines. Priests still made offerings to mountain spirits and water deities. But now, those rituals were folded into a wider pattern. The sun god Inti took center stage, but he did not stand alone. The Inca had a word for this, Yanantin sacred duality, the idea that two different things could live together in balance. Male and female, earth and sky, old and new. This principle guided how they ruled. Local leaders, once rivals, were made Curaca's leaders under the Inca, but still respected by their own people. Sons of nobility were brought to Cusco, trained in the Inca way, and returned home as bridges between worlds. Languages were kept, even as Quechua spread. Textiles continued their regional patterns, even as the Inca mark was added. The empire became a tapestry, woven of many threads, each different in shade, but held together by a single rhythm. Roads connected them. Buildings anchored them. Rituals aligned them. Unity did not mean sameness. It meant harmony. And in this harmony, the empire grew strong. Not because it erased, but because it remembered. Because it knew that strength lies not in making everything alike, but in guiding everything together. Even today, in the highlands and valleys, that spirit endures. In the songs that echo through market stalls, in the patterns of cloth, in the shapes of ancient walls. The Inca are gone, but their dream of unity through diversity still breathes in the stones. Chapter 10. Masters of the Vertical World. In the towering silence of the Andes, where the sky feels close enough to touch and the earth falls away beneath your feet, the Inca built their world not along the ground but up the side of it. Here, in one of the steepest landscapes on earth, they did something almost no one had done before. They farmed the mountains. Terraces carved from stone hugged the slopes like great green steps, each one a measured breadth of land, catching soil before it could fall and holding water before it could vanish. These terraces were not scattered. They were layered, structured, purposeful. From a distance, they looked like staircases rising into the clouds. But these were not built for walking. They were built for feeding an empire. The Inca understood the mountain like a doctor understands the body. They knew where the frost would settle, where the sun would linger, where the wind would bite. They matched each crop to its perfect altitude: potatoes in the cold heights, maize in the warm valleys, quinoa in between. Each layer of the mountain was a different world, and each world had something to offer. Terracing allowed the Inca to stop erosion and make use of rainwater. Without it, the soil would have slipped away, the seeds drowned or burned. But with it, they turned bare slopes into thriving gardens. And these gardens were not small, they stretched for miles. Across canyons, around ridges, weaving through villages like ribbons of life. In places like Moray, terraces were shaped into circular depressions, each ring its own climate. It was not just agriculture, it was experimentation. The Inca were learning, testing, perfecting. Their science was quiet, held in the shape of the land. And always there was beauty. The stonework was careful, the lines precise. These terraces were built to last, and many still do. They remain today, 1,000 years later, still green, still growing, still whispering the story of a people who looked at a cliff and saw a field. The vertical archipelago. Most civilizations are built on horizontal land, flat plains, rolling valleys, open fields. But the Inca lived in a world of extremes where altitude could shift the seasons with a single step. Walk a few miles in the Andes and you might pass from icy winds to tropical heat, from snow-covered peaks to river-warmed forests. The Inca didn't just survive this, they turned it into a system. They called it the vertical archipelago. Like islands in a sea of mountains, each ecological zone was treated as a separate resource linked not by water, but by will. Instead of trying to grow everything in one place, the Inca assigned different communities to manage different altitudes. One village might care for coca fields in the lowlands, another might raise llamas in the high pastures, another might tend maize near the riverbanks, but they were not isolated. They were connected through roads, through runners, through ritual. Goods moved between them, not in markets with coins, but through barter, reciprocity, and shared duty. The highlands sent potatoes down to the valleys. The jungle gave up fruits and dyes. Wool moved from alpaca herders to weavers far below. This system was not random. It was mapped, structured, understood. The Inca government tracked it all, measured who grew what, who gave what, and where it needed to go. It was logistics at the scale of mountains, and it worked without writing. Without wheels, without beasts of burden beyond the humble llama. In the vertical archipelago, geography became strategy. The Inca didn't fight their landscape, they made it a partner. They used it to build a web of life that stretched across every ridge and ravine, holding people together through trade, through trust, through terrain. And in doing so, they didn't just feed their people. They created a system of abundance, one that turned the impossible into the everyday. Sacred waterworks, wherever the Inca made the mountains bloom, there flowed a hidden network beneath it, all carved into the stone, unseen but essential. It was water, guided by wisdom, moving not with chance but with care. In the Inca world, irrigation was not only science, it was ceremony. They built canals, long, narrow, perfect lines of smooth stone, stretching from glacial springs to terraced fields. Some were centuries old before the empire rose. Others were crafted with tools of copper and stone, carried across cliffs by baskets and backs. Water ran through them like a living pulse, never rushing, never wasted. These canals followed not just the slope of the land, but the rhythm of the people. Some led to ceremonial fountains, where water was offered to the gods. Others trickled through sacred gardens, feeding maize that would be used in rituals or filling ponds that reflected the stars. At Tipan, near Cusco, the water still flows, falling in gentle tears, as if the land itself is sighing. The builders of these canals understood more than engineering. They understood balance. If water came too quickly, it would wash the soil away. If it came too slowly, the crops would die. The flow had to match the need. And so, they designed systems that listened to the earth, to the weather, to the ancestors. Every channel was a covenant, a promise to treat water not as a thing to control, but as a being to serve. Water was the blood of the mountains. It connected glacier to field, field to stomach, stomach to ceremony. The Inca knew this. They honored it. In the dry season, people sang for rain. In the wet season, they prayed for gentle skies. They offered chicha-corn beer and scattered flower petals into streams. They built shrines at springs, marked stones with carvings, and told stories of water spirits who watched over every drop. This was not technology separate from spirit. It was both. It was the human hand and the divine flow working together to feed, to sustain, to bless. Fields of ceremony in the Inca world, to plant was not just to sow, it was to speak. To the earth, to the gods, to the ancestors watching from the high peaks. Agriculture was a sacred act, and every field was a kind of temple. Each season began not with tools, but with ritual. When the solstice came, the priests climbed the temples. They studied the sun's angle, watching where its rays fell. This told them when to plant. The first furrow was not dug by a farmer, but by the emperor himself using a golden plow surrounded by song and silence. It was not for food alone. It was for the future. Before planting, coca leaves were offered. The soil was blessed. Llamas were sacrificed, their blood spilled not in cruelty, but in exchange a gift for the land, a prayer for rain. Harvest festivals came with drums and dances, with feasts that lasted for days. Women wove new garments. Men brewed chicha. Children learned the songs of their people. Each crop had a spirit. Maize was sacred to the sun. Potatoes belonged to the Earth Mother, Pachamama. Quinoa was watched over by the moon. Farmers did not just grow, they honored. They walked between rows with care, speaking softly, touching leaves with reverence. Even tools had meaning. The chakwatakla, a foot plow, was shaped with purpose, passed down from parent to child. It broke the soil in rhythm with breath, with step, with song. Planting was done in lines and unity, hands moving as one, hearts focused on the earth dot and the high fields above Cusco near the great temples. Special gardens grew maize not for food, but for ceremony. Every stalk was wrapped in cloth, every kernel seen as a gem. These fields were guarded day and night, watered by hand, tended by chosen ones. They were not farms, they were altars in this world. Nothing was just practical. Every act was layered. Every seed held meaning. To farm was to remember. To harvest was to give thanks. And in every field, in every furrow, the Inca left behind not just food, but faith. Chapter 11. The Sun, the Temple, and the King. In the sacred light of the high Andes, where clouds drifted close enough to touch and golden rays warmed the stone with slow precision, the Inca saw more than nature, they saw divinity, and at the center of it all was the sun. His name was Inti. The sun was not just a celestial body to the Inca, he was a father, a source of life and warmth, a god who looked down each morning and watched his children walk the world below. And from this radiant father came the Sapa Inca, the emperor, the ruler, the unique one. He was not just a king. He was a direct descendant of Inti, a living beam of sunlight in human form. When the Sapa Inca spoke, his voice was believed to carry the will of the sun. When he walked, it was said the earth responded. People averted their eyes in his presence, not out of fear, but reverence. He wore golden discs and fine robes woven from the soft wool of alpacas, but it was his lineage that made him sacred. His blood shimmered with divine purpose. This belief in divine rulership gave the empire its structure. It was not simply a hierarchy of humans, it was a mirror of the heavens. Just as the sun stood high above, casting warmth and light to all. So too did the Sapa Inca watch over the land, his reach stretching from mountaintop to ocean shore. His role was not to dominate, but to maintain balance, to keep harmony between sky and soil, between gods and people. Every sunrise was a reaffirmation of his right to rule. Every harvest, a blessing extended from his divine ancestry. He was both servant and sovereign, chosen to carry the sun's light through valleys and across stone roads. And when he died, his body was not buried in silence. It was preserved, honored, and still consulted, because though the sun sets each day, it always rises again. The temple at the center, in the middle of Cusco, the capital of the empire, stood a building that seemed to glow with its own light. Its name was Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun. To the Inca, it was more than stone and gold. It was the very center of the world. Coricancha was built to honor Inti, the sun god, and by extension, to honor the divine role of the Sapa Inca. Its walls were made of carefully fitted stones, shaped to perfection, angled to hold strong through time and tremor. And then they were covered in gold. Sheets of the precious metal shimmered in the morning light, reflecting not just sunlight, but belief. Inside the temple were gardens unlike any other fields, where the corn did not sway, but stood frozen in time. Each stalk, each ear, each leaf was sculpted from gold and silver. Llamas stood nearby, life-sized and lifeless, crafted in fine metalwork, their fur etched with gentle lines. These offerings were not decorations. They were acts of devotion, representations of abundance gifted back to the God who made such abundance possible. Priests moved through the temple with quiet purpose. They tended the sacred fires. They aligned rituals with the movement of stars and shadows. They watched as the rising sun slipped over the mountain ridges, lighting the eastern wall each dawn with soft fire. That first touch of golden light meant everything. It was the sun's presence made visible. It was divine approval, renewed each day. Coricancha wasn't just a temple. It was the origin point. From here, everything radiated roads, rituals, rhythms of the empire. Travelers bowed. As they passed, messengers carried word from its doors. The emperor himself came here to speak to the gods, to renew his role, to ask for guidance. And when solstices arrived, the temple became a stage, where sky and stone and people came together in perfect choreography. In that golden chamber, belief became real, light became law. And from Coricancha, the empire unfolded not by force, but by radiance. The sec lines from the heart of Coricancha, something invisible, stretched outward, lines drawn not in stone, but in memory. These were the Sikhs, an ancient network of sacred paths that radiated from the temple like rays of the sun. 41 lines in all, each one leading to a different waka, a sacred place in the land. Together they created a map not of borders, but of belief. Wakas could be anything. A spring, a large stone, a hill, a tree. What mattered was not their shape, but their story. Each one held spiritual power. Each one connected the people to their ancestors, their gods, their duties. And every waka along a sec line was counted, visited, remembered. Some were simple. Others were sites of pilgrimage and ritual. But all of them mattered. Every community in the Cusco region was responsible for one or more wakas. It was their task to tend to these places, to keep them clean, to offer coca leaves or corn or prayer. This was not just a spiritual obligation, it was part of empire. The Sikhs created a structure of memory binding people to land and land to empire. These lines were used in ceremonies, in harvest rituals, in the marking of time. Priests traveled them with intention. Messengers passed through them as they carried news from sacred place to sacred place. Each line held its own identity, its own pattern of stops, its own rhythm. And together, they formed a web across the key landscape, tying valleys and villages to the sacred center at Korakancha. The Sikhs were not drawn on paper. They lived in minds, in stories, in feet that walked the paths year after year. They were knowledge made communal, geography made sacred. In this way, the Inca turned the land itself into a temple where every stone had meaning, every path a purpose, and every community a role. The sect lines didn't just organize space, they organized spirit. And through them, the Inca wove their people into a single living fabric. Worship as administration. In the Inca world, the sacred and the state were not separate. They were threads of the same cloth. To rule was to serve the divine, and to worship was to organize the world. Priests were more than guardians of temples. They were calendar keepers, engineers of time. Their rituals marked the seasons, aligning planting with solstices, harvests with equinoxes. Their ceremonies told the people when to build, when to rest, when to prepare. Time was not measured by clocks. It was felt through festivals. Every month had its own sacred duties. Some were for planting, some for gathering, others for sacrifice or celebration. These moments were not optional. They were how the empire breathed. To miss a festival was to miss a beat in the great rhythm of the realm. The state funded temples. It built shrines across the land. It appointed priests and priestesses trained in astronomy, agriculture, and ceremony. Their work kept not just faith alive, but empire functioning. Offerings weren't random, they were structured. Tributes of maize, textiles, and chicha were tallied, prepared, and delivered according to ritual schedules. When drought threatened the crops, it wasn't the army that marched, it was the priesthood. They climbed the mountains, carrying sacred bundles, offering songs and sacrifice at high-altitude shrines. In times of abundance, they gave thanks, inviting entire villages to join in celebration. These rituals reminded everyone, leaders and laborers alike, that survival came not only from effort, but from favor. From harmony between people and the gods. Religion was not escape, it was foundation. It guided the building of roads, the storing of grain, the timing of war and peace. It bound the distant provinces to Cusco, not just with orders, but with belief. In the empire of the Inca, the sacred was the system. And from Korakancha to the farthest Waka, from the Sepa Inca to the humblest farmer, every heartbeat moved in time with the sun. Chapter 12. The Fabric of Society. In the great mountains of the Andes, where rivers carved valleys and the wind moved gently across high plains, the Inca people built their world from the inside out, not through monuments or armies, but through people. At the center of their society was something both small and vast. The Ayllus. An Ayllu was more than a village. It was a shared life, a group of families linked not just by blood, but by duty, memory, and care. Everyone belonged to one. From the heights of Cusco to the edges of the empire, The Alu was home. It gave each person an identity, someone to labor beside, someone to mourn with, someone to celebrate with. It was the soil in which the roots of the empire grew strong. God in each Alu, land was not owned by individuals. It was shared, worked together in seasonal cycles. Some fields fed the people. Others were planted for the empire or for the gods. Tools were passed between neighbors. Food was divided evenly. Decisions were made by elders or leaders chosen for wisdom and fairness, not for wealth or war. Rituals were woven into this shared life. Births, marriages, and deaths were marked not in private silence, but in community gathering. Each child knew their role. Each elder carried stories that stretched back through generations. To be Inca was not to stand alone. It was to stand as part of something wider, deeper, and older than oneself. When drought came, the Alu pulled together. When the harvest was rich, they celebrated as one. Even in grief, even in hardship, the Alu did not fracture. This was its strength. And it is why, across such difficult terrain and over such vast distances, the empire remained connected not just by roads, but by people bound together in kinship and trust, weaving the world high in the mountain homes where women sat beside. Open fires or under the bright sky, another kind of labor unfold, quiet, patient, and sacred. It was the work of weaving. In the Inca world, cloth was more than cloth. It was language. It was status. It was the memory of a people woven into every thread. From the wool of alpacas and llamas, women spun fine threads, dyed with colors pulled from nature, reds from cochineal insects, blues from rare plants, yellows from flowers kissed by sunlight. These threads became patterns, and the patterns became messages. Each design carried meaning lines that spoke of lineage, symbols that marked region or rank, colors that honored the gods or seasons. Textiles were gifts to the gods, offerings to the emperor, and records of ritual. The most skilled weavers, often chosen young, were trained in special schools and served in the temples. They were known as Akla, or chosen women. Their hands were steady, their focus deep. They wove not just to clothe, but to honor the sun, the moon, and the land itself. Cloth wrapped the newborn and the dead. It marked victories, sealed alliances, and signaled loyalty. A finely woven tunic could declare power more loudly than any sword. Soldiers marched in uniforms that unified them. Messengers carried messages wrapped in cloth that told the receiver everything they needed to know. Even the emperor wore garments woven only once. So sacred was the work that no garment, touched twice by the same body, could be reused. It was said that each thread held the spirit of the maker, and that weaving was not simply skill, but prayer made visible. In a world where words were not written in books, cloth became the canvas of culture. Through it, the Inca remembered, ruled, and reached across mountains. Labor as devotion. Unlike other great civilizations, the Inca did not use coins or charge taxes in gold. Instead, they created something different, something personal. It was called Mida, a labor system built on reciprocity, devotion, and shared responsibility. Each year, every able-bodied citizen owed time to the state, not in endless servitude, but in carefully structured service. One season might be spent helping build a road, laying stones across high passes where only llamas dared to tread. Another might call for working the fields of the Sapa Inca, growing maize for state stores. In times of war, one's turn might come on the battlefield, not as a paid soldier, but as a citizen defending something sacred. This labor wasn't forced in the way modern minds might imagine. It was expected, yes, but also honored. The meta was a chance to serve, to be part of something larger. It was understood that the time given would return. After a season of labor, workers returned to their elu, and the empire returned its thanks with food from state granaries during lean months, with protection from raiders, with festivals that lifted the spirit and reminded everyone of their place in the great order. Supervisors known as Caracas ensured fairness. They knew who had served and who was due rest. They managed the work not with cruelty, but with care, because they too were part of the same fabric. From youngest to oldest, all knew the rhythm. Even the elderly gave guidance, tending fires or sharing knowledge while others lifted stones or tilled the earth. Temples were built through mita. Storehouses that fed entire regions were stocked by it. The famed Inca roads, stretching thousands of miles, were laid stone by stone through this system. And because of this, the empire did not crumble under its own weight. It stood tall, held up by hands willing to work, not for coin, but for one. Another dot in this way, labor became sacred. Not just effort, but devotion. A gift of time and strength, given freely and returned with honor. Balance between the worlds. The world of the Inca was never one-sided. It lived in balance, in the space, between light and shadow, between fire and water, between the sun and the moon. And in their society, this balance was mirrored not just in belief, but in everyday life between men and women, between roles and rituals. Men and women both shaped the empire. They did not hold equal roles, but they held complementary ones. Together, they formed a dual system that kept the world steady like two sides of the same coin. Men farmed, governed, led armies, and kept the records of labor. But women were not hidden or silent. They brewed the ritual drink chicha offered at festivals and ceremonies. They wove the cloth that marked the sacred. They prayed, sang, and served as priestesses in temples where the goddess of the moon, Mama Quilla, was honored. Women oversaw households and also led spiritual duties. In certain regions, they even helped lead local elas, passing down wisdom that had flowed through grandmothers and mothers for generations. Boys were taught the ways of the land. Girls, the ways of the loom and the altar. Yet both were needed. One without the other would bring imbalance, an offense not just to society, but to the world itself. The Inca saw duality not as opposition, but as harmony. The sun needed the moon. The earth needed the rain. The emperor, divine child of Inti, ruled alongside high priestesses who channeled the voice of Mama Quilla. Rituals required both masculine and feminine energy to be complete. And so did life. In architecture, this belief appeared in pairs temples for sun and moon, two doorways for each shrine. In the calendar, festivals danced between planting and harvesting, between fire and water, always in motion but always in balance. This harmony was not perfection. It was motion. A dance between forces, gently held in place by belief, by culture, by shared rhythm. And it is perhaps this balance, more than gold or conquest, that allowed the Inca Empire to grow so vast yet still feel whole. Chapter 30. The Empire Expands. In the quiet dawn after Pachacuti's reign, the Inca world stood at the edge of something immense. What had begun as a single city in the highlands had grown into a beating heart. But now, it would become something more, a body that would stretch across deserts, mountains, valleys, and coasts. The man who led this next great leap was Tupac Inca Yupanqui, son of Pachacati. Heir to vision and fire, he did not walk in his father's shadow. He expanded it. Under his rule, the Inca world more than doubled in size. From the sacred city of Cusco, he reached out in every direction. Each step was measured, each conquest deliberate. Yet the spear was not his only tool. Tupac Inca used persuasion as often as force, sending messengers ahead of his armies, bearing not threats, but promises. He offered marriages, alliances, protection. To join the Inca realm was to be seen, counted, welcomed into the celestial rhythm of Inti, the sun. Every land added to the empire was woven into the grand design. Valleys were not merely claimed, they were studied, named, folded into the empire's system of knowledge. Mountains were honored. Springs were marked with stones. Even the most distant village became a part of something larger, not forgotten on the edge, but given a place in the map of the sun's journey. This expansion was not aimless. It followed a path of purpose, a geometry drawn not just on the earth, but in the sky. Every new region strengthened the empire's breath. And so the world of the Inca became not just wider, but deeper. No longer simply a kingdom, it became a continent of spirit and soil, held together by roads, ritual, and the will to belong. To the north and the sea, Tupac Inca's eyes turned north, toward new lands bathed in cloud and green. Beyond the mountains, past rivers and forests, lay the Chima kingdom, rich, ancient, and proud. At its heart stood Chan Chan, a city made not of stone but of adobe, with walls carved in waves and birds and corridors that whispered of old power. Chima were skilled in many things: metalwork, irrigation, and city design. They had their own ways, their own gods. But Tupac Inca came not to erase, but to fold. The Chima resisted, as any great kingdom would. But the Inca strategy was more than military. They brought overwhelming organization, roadways, and a promise of unity. In time, the Chima world was not destroyed, it was added. Their knowledge became Inca knowledge. Their hands built Inca dreams. From there, Tupac Inca stood at the edge of the Pacific. The sea stretched out before him, silent and endless. But he did not stop. He ordered ships, reed vessels crafted by skilled hands, to sail into the unknown. These were not warships, but explorers. Their goal was to find islands, to see how far the Inca world might go. It was said they returned with strange stories and unfamiliar gifts, fruits not known to the mountains, feathers from birds not seen in the Andes. This turning to the sea was not mere curiosity. It revealed something deeper. The empire's dreams were not bound by land. They looked outward always. Each conquest, each voyage was not for gold or pride. It was to understand the shape of the world and the Inca's place within it. Diplomacy in stone and thread. The strength of the empire was not only in its soldiers, but in its ability to listen, to learn, to offer more than fear. The Inca mastered diplomacy with the same care they laid their stones. There were many paths into the empire, and not all were marched by armies. A daughter, royal and graceful, might be married to a neighboring king. In her presence came peace, and in her children, a binding of lineages. A local temple might be rebuilt in shining stone, not in the name of Inti alone, but alongside the local god, honored and lifted. In this way, faith was not broken, it was embraced and raised higher. In times of famine, the Inca did not stand back. They sent caravans of food from their storehouses. Maize, dried meat, and salt were carried across mountains to hungry villages. The message was simple: join us and you will not be forgotten. You will not face hardship alone. Gifts were given freely, but they carried a deeper meaning. A fine tunic, a golden cup, a llama adorned in woven cloth, these were more than items. They were symbols. To receive them was to be seen by the empire, to be invited into its rhythm. Even thread became a tool of diplomacy. Fine textiles, woven with sacred patterns, were sent to leaders as signs of respect. These garments spoke without words. They said, "You matter, you belong." And for many, this was more powerful than any sword. Thus, diplomacy moved quietly but firmly. It threaded people into the empire's fabric not by breaking their past, but by promising a future. The four quarters breathed as one. By the end of Tupac Inca's reign, the empire was no longer simply expanding, it was breathing. It had become a living body known as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. Each Sioux or region had its role. The north, Chinchasuyu, held valleys and rivers. The south, Calasuyu, swept into the highlands and the edges of Bolivia. The west, Contisuyu, curled toward the coast. And the east, Antisuyu, reached into jungle and mystery. Each quarter was like an organ, vital and connected. Roads stretched like veins from the heart in Cusco, carrying people, messages, and goods. Messengers, swift and sure, ran from one corner to another. They didn't carry scrolls or maps, but knotted cords called quipu, strings of meaning used to record numbers, events, and offerings. Storehouses QOLLQ as dotted the land like quiet lungs, full of food, tools, and textiles. In times of peace, they stood ready. In times of drought or war, they gave life. The state did not wait to be needed, it prepared. Always. But more than logistics, more than planning, there was spirit. Each part of the empire, from the snowy peaks of Quito to the desert valleys of Chile, knew it was part of something greater. They shared rituals. They danced under the same stars. They marked the solstice with the same fires. Even if those fires burned thousands of miles apart. In Tawantinsuyu, diversity did not break unity. It enriched it. Different tongues were spoken, but the road spoke one language. Different gods were honored, but the sun touched them all. This was not an empire of sameness. It was an empire of harmony, each note different, but together forming. A powerful song. Tupac Inca left behind no monuments louder than this. A world not ruled by fear, but by shared purpose. An empire not stitched with chains, but with thread. And as the four quarters breathed as one, the dream of Tawantinsuyu rose. Higher than any mountain, wide enough to touch the clouds. Chapter 14, Roads Across the Sky, high above the valleys, where the winds kiss the stone and clouds drift like pale ghosts, there stretched a road unlike any other. The Capac On, the great Inca road, ran like a sacred spine through the heart of the empire. It was not a single road, but a vast network, over 24,000 miles long, lacing the Andean mountains, crossing deserts and jungles, from present-day Colombia to Chile. the backbone of an empire carved without the wheel, without iron, and without horses. And yet, it worked seamlessly, astonishingly, gracefully. It began in Cusco, the center of the Inca world, the navel of their universe. From there, it extended like arms reaching across the land in all directions. The roads were paved with stone in many parts, carefully fitted together by hands that had memorized the mountain's mood. Steps were cut directly into rock faces. Pathways wrapped tightly around cliffs, barely wide enough for a traveler's feet. And still, the Incas built on. These were not ordinary roads. They were ceremonial arteries built for state control, yes, but also for sacred movement. Along the Capac Own, the Sapa Inca's power flowed outward like blood through veins. Soldiers marched, messengers ran, priests journeyed to sacred sites, and common people walked with quiet reverence, their steps part of a rhythm older than memory. The feat is even more extraordinary when you consider what the Inca lacked. No wheels turned along these roads. No oxen dragged carts. Everything was done by foot or by the sure-footed llama who carried burdens across dizzying heights. The tools used were simple, stone and bone. The earth was not forced, it was persuaded. Every curve of the road respected the land's natural shape. Every rise and fall was measured by experience, by intuition, by generations who had listened to the mountains whisper. The Capac Own was a triumph not just of engineering, but of unity. It stitched together a land of extreme contrast. Cold peaks and humid forests, salt flats and river valleys, all woven into one fabric with the road as thread. This was how an empire could breathe. Even across impossible distances, the chasqui fly, and along these sacred roads, the message flew. Not on wings, but on legs. The legs of the chasqui, the messengers of the empire. Dressed in light tunics and sandals, carrying satchels slung across their backs, they were runners trained for endurance, for clarity, for speed. The chasqui were more than messengers. They were the empire's voice. At every tambo, spaced precisely along the road. One chasqui waited for the other. When he saw the dust cloud rising from the path, he stood tall, alert. The arriving runner would pass the message, sometimes a quipu, a corded knot of information, sometimes a spoken sentence, and without pause, the next chasqui would take off, his feet barely brushing the ground. Like runners in a sacred relay, they moved news across the empire faster than any beast could travel. Messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days. From Cusco to Quito, from the highlands to the ocean shores, words soared on sandal-clad feet. The Sapa Inca could speak to his governors in the far corners of the realm without ever leaving the throne. Orders, blessings, warnings, all delivered in a chain of breath and muscle. But the chasqui were more than speed. They were memory keepers. Many messages were oral, passed exactly from mouth to ear, unchanged. The chasqui trained to recall complex phrases, to speak them clearly, with no mistake. They were trusted not just to move, but to remember. Their stations were simple. Small tambos near the road's edge. Inside, a clay jug of water, a place to rest, fresh sandals. But there was little time for rest. The chasqui did not linger. They were part of a living system, always in motion. Their rhythm matched the empire's heartbeat. And in this way, the Inca achieved what others could only dream. An empire connected not by technology, but by people, feet on stone. voice in air, message in motion, bridges in the air, but the road did not always run across solid ground. Sometimes it had to float. In the steep Andean terrain, deep gorges and violent rivers tore through the land like scars. To cross them, the Inca created one of their most magical inventions: rope bridges woven from grass, suspended like whispers over the void. These bridges, called jascachaca, were made entirely from natural fibers. The material was ichu grass, thin, strong, and abundant in the highlands. Women and men of the village would gather the grass, twist it into strands, braid those strands into thick ropes, and then anchor the ropes across great chasms. The largest bridges stretched more than 100 feet, dangling above rapids that roared like gods. Crossing them required courage. The bridges swayed in the wind, every step creaked, but they held. They always held. The Inca engineers knew their craft, and their designs were passed down like sacred songs. Anchored in stone on both ends, reinforced with smaller side ropes, the bridges could carry people, animals, even loads of food and goods. But they did not last forever. Grass wears away with time, with rain, with use. So each year the community rebuilt them together. The old bridge would be cut and fall into the gorge below. Then, with ceremony and laughter and song, the people would gather to remake it. Children helped twist fibers. Elders supervised the knots. It was a moment of unity, a sacred act of maintenance that bound more than just rope. Today, in places like Huachaca in Peru, that tradition still lives. Once a year, villagers still gathered to rebuild their ancient bridge, just as their ancestors did. The air fills with the scent of grass and river, the sound of woven voices. And as the new bridge stretches once more across the sky, a piece of the Inca spirit rises with it. Tambo, the empire's pulse, every road, every bridge, every chasqui needed something to sustain it. That something was the tambo, the quiet, steady pulse of the empire. Tambos were placed all along the Capac-One, spaced by design. Some were simple shelters. Others were vast complexes. But all served a purpose: to keep the empire moving. Inside a tambo, a traveler could find shelter from the cold. There might be pots of chicha, the sacred corn drink, stored for those in need. Blankets made of alpaca wool, salt, maize, tools, oil for lamps, even ceremonial offerings. They were not shops, they were not homes. Tambos belonged to the state, but they served the people. Soldiers moving between borders could rest and eat. Priests carrying sacred objects could find privacy. The chasqui could swap messages and replenish strength. Farmers on pilgrimage, nobles on inspection. All who walked the roads could pause and breathe and be still. In a tambo, the empire became intimate. Its planning became personal. Imagine a traveler stepping into the shelter, his sandals dusty, his breath thin from the high altitude. There, waiting for him, was a blanket folded neatly, a bowl of food, and silence. It was not grand, but it was enough. And in that quiet corner of the mountains, far from Cusco's gold, the Inca vision came alive, not through conquest or riches, but through care. The tambos made the road human. They turned long journeys into possible ones. They turned wilderness into something tender. And they whispered a truth that the Inca seemed to understand deeply. That power was not just measured in stone or size, but in how well one cared for the steps of another. Even now, many tambos remain hidden in overgrown fields or tucked into slopes. Stones still mark the walls. Shadows remember the warmth. And if you close your eyes and listen, you might hear the footfalls echoing still. Chapter 15. The Calm Before the Storm. In the final years of the 15th century, the Inca Empire gleamed with power and purpose. From the snow-capped summits of the Andes to the warm valleys that fed its people, the realm appeared untouchable. Its roads were still pulsing, its temples filled with song, its rulers cloaked in gold and confidence. At its heart stood Huayna Capac, the son of the sun, a sovereign both feared and beloved. He had inherited a world already mighty, and he would make it even greater. But even greatness holds the seeds of change. Huayna Capac did something no Inca ruler before him had dared. He built a second capital. Far from Cusco, the place was Tumabamba, nestled in what is now southern Ecuador. It was not a mere outpost or royal retreat. Tumabamba was a mirror of the empire's heart, with paved plazas, shining temples, and royal halls carved in stone. Craftsmen from Cusco were summoned to sculpt its soul. Stones were hauled over impossible distances. Sacred rites were performed. Beneath the same stars that watched over the southern highlands, the city was meant to impress, and it did. It brought the northern provinces closer and showed that the Inca power stretched even to the outermost skies. For Huayna Capac, it was a way to stitch the distant corners of his empire even tighter. But something subtle shifted. The emperor no longer ruled from Cusco, the city where the sun's energy was believed to gather, the city that held the sacred thread connecting heaven and earth. Years passed, and Huayna Capac remained in Tumabamba. His absence grew longer. The capital's rituals carried on, but without the living presence of the Sapa Inca, the rituals began to feel thinner, more like shadows than songs. Cusco still stood strong, but its spirit began to flicker like a fire burning low. And with that flicker came the first soft cracks, quiet, almost invisible. But cracks, nonetheless. The people in the north rejoiced in their new prestige. But in the center of the empire, the sacred cord that once ran unbroken between the Inca and the gods began to fray. And as it frayed, history took a breath. A long, deep breath before the coming storm. The silent invader, while the empire looked inward, balancing new capitals, managing growing regions, praising its golden ruler, something unseen crept toward them. Something silent. Something they had never prepared for. Far beyond the ocean's edge, in lands the Inca did not know, ships had crossed waters no Indian priest had ever dreamed of. These ships carried not just explorers, but illnesses. And before a single foreign foot stepped into the highlands, disease had already arrived. It began slowly. A cough here, a fever there. Then entire families lay still in their homes. Villages fell silent. In places where laughter once echoed, there were only birds, confused by the quiet. Smallpox had entered the Inca world not through battle, not through conquest, but like a ghost drifting on the wind. It moved along the very roads the Inca had built to bind their world together. The Capac Own, once a path of glory, became a highway of sickness. Messengers carried not just orders, but infection. Priests visited temples, not knowing they brought death with every touch. Fields were left untended as farmers weakened and fell. Ceremonies were interrupted as singers lost their voices and elders passed without final words. The sacred cycle. of the land broke in Tumabamba, Huayna Capac fell ill. His strength, once as solid as stone, began to fade. His eyes dulled. His voice weakened. Beside him, his chosen heir, Ninan Kayochi, also grew sick. The healers tried everything herbs. From jungle trees, prayers from mountaintop shrines. But nothing worked. Both father and son died in quiet rooms, far from the sacred navel of Cusco. Their bodies were preserved, their spirits honored, but their death sent a tremor through the empire. For the first time in living memory, the Inca throne stood empty. And worse, it stood uncertain. The empire, so proud and wide, now felt fragile. And into that fragile space, shadows began to pour. A house divided with Huayna Capac gone, and Ninan Kayochi dead before he could take the throne. The empire faced something it had not seen in centuries, a crisis of blood. Two sons remained, both royal, both ambitious. Both believed they were meant to rule. One was Atahualpa, raised in the north, close to Tumabamba, near his father in his final days. The other was Huascar, rooted in Cusco, trained in the rituals, trusted by the priests. The empire now had two centers, two claims, two hearts, and only one throne. At first, there were tense letters, envoys, demands. But soon, words gave way to war. Atahualpa gathered armies in the north. Huascar declared himself the rightful Sapa Inca in the south. The Capac Own, once a symbol of unity, now carried soldiers to battle rather than pilgrims to shrines. Mountains that once echoed with prayer now shook with the rhythm of war drums. Villages were burned, fields trampled, families torn between loyalty and survival. This was not just a civil war. It was a spiritual rupture. The Inca believed that harmony held the world together. That balance between sun and moon, between rulers and people, was sacred. But now that balance was shattered. Priests watched in fear as temples were desecrated. Sacred objects were lost in chaos. Rituals were interrupted by bloodshed. The world felt like it was tilting. Something deep was unraveling. Atahualpa proved to be the stronger commander. His generals moved like thunderclouds across the highlands, and eventually Huascar was captured. But even in victory, something was lost. The soul of the empire had been torn. The people were tired. The land was wounded. And though Atahualpa now wore the royal fringe, he ruled over an empire that was no longer whole. Just as calm seemed to return, history stepped forward again. The ships on the horizon, while brothers fought and fields burned, no one looked west. Beyond the mountains, beyond the shores, straying sails floated near the coast. Pale ships, moved by canvas wings, with crosses painted on their masts. They came quietly, almost shyly, like animals scenting unknown territory. The first to arrive were few, just a handful of men with armor that gleamed like the sun and animals the Inca had never seen before. They spoke a language no one understood. Their eyes scanned everything: stonework, temples, people, not with wonder, but with hunger. The Inca had no word for what was coming. No prophecy warned of it. No prayer had prepared them. These ships belonged to Spain, and with them came Francisco Pizarro. Atahualpa, still recovering from civil war, did not see the danger at first. He saw a curiosity, perhaps even an opportunity. He agreed to meet the newcomers. He came dressed in gold, surrounded by dancers and priests carrying the dignity of generations. But he did not see the net closing around him. The Spaniards saw not an emperor, but a key. A way to unlock a treasure so vast it dazzled their dreams. And with swift, brutal motion, they captured Atahualpa. Not in battle, but through betrayal. Empire gasped. Its ruler, taken by strangers. Its heart in chains. No army had ever done this. No rebellion had ever dared. And as the news spread, the world the Inca had built began to tremble. What followed would be invasion, conquest, collapse. But in this final moment, before it all fell apart, the land was still. The sun still rose. The mountains still watched. And the empire, though bleeding, still breathed. This was the calm before the storm. The last quiet moment before the world changed forever. Chapter 16. The day the sun was taken. The mountain air around Cajamarca was still, carrying the scent of hot springs and eucalyptus. The November sun hung gently over the Andes, casting long shadows on the worn paths that led to the town. In the heart of this sacred place, the Inca ruler Atahualpa sat in comfort. Just weeks earlier, he had emerged victorious from a long and bloody civil war, his rival brother Huáscar defeated, and the empire seemingly whole once more. The throne was his. From his court in Cajamarca, Atahualpa issued commands, surrounded by nobles, dancers, warriors, and sages. Music flowed softly through the air, and the baths were warm with volcanic waters. For the Inca, this was a time of peace, of celebration, and of sacred restoration. His court was vast and radiant. Fine garments woven from vicuna wool wrapped his attendants, their colors bold and symbols embroidered with purpose. Chasqui the swift runners moved like wind across the empire, carrying news, tribute, and offerings to the northern capital. The army, though immense in number, had been allowed to rest. Weapons were set aside. There was no need for fear. Victory had been secured not long ago, and the gods had been honored with sacrifice and ceremony. Atahualpa, revered as the sun of the sun, believed the empire was protected by divine order. What could threaten them now? And so, the Inca king remained at ease. He bathed in thermal pools that gurgled softly beneath the earth, speaking with his advisors under open skies. Priests whispered the movements of the stars, assuring him that all was in harmony. The hills around Cajamarca were quiet, but far below, beyond the coast, something stirred. Without warning, a new kind of stranger had stepped into the world. Of the Andes, unseen, unknown, and unexpected. And they were already approaching, strangers from the sea far across the arid western plains. At the edge of Inca knowledge, a small group of men from another world had entered Peru. They wore metal, where others wore cloth. Their skin was pale, their language strange. These were the conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro. Only 168 men had come ashore, yet they carried weapons unlike anything the Inca had ever seen. Swords of shining steel, long-range muskets, and animals that thundered like storms. Horses. To the people of the Andes, the Spanish were more than men. Some thought they were gods or spirits. They came with crosses and swords, speaking of a single God who ruled all others, and of a king across the sea who claimed lands he had never seen. They did not ask permission. They believed the world belonged to them. Francisco Pizarro had been to these lands before. He knew their wealth, their splendor, their vulnerability. And now, With Atahualpa isolated from his capital and surrounded only by peaceful attendants, Pizarro saw an opportunity. The Spanish had come not merely to explore, but to conquer. Their mission was fueled by gold, by glory, and by the conviction that their faith made their violence righteous. Their march through the Andes had been cautious but deliberate, and now they stood at the edge of Cajamarca armed, hidden, and ready. The Inca messengers had seen them. Stories had reached Atahualpa's ears. But still, the king felt no fear. What could a handful of strangers do? They were invited to meet as guests in peace. There would be no battle. The Inca emperor would speak to them with dignity. That was the tradition. That was the law. But the strangers from the sea did not come to talk. They came with a trap. The trap is sprung. The great plaza of Cajamarca was wide and enclosed by high walls and arcades. On the day of the meeting, thousands of Atahualpa's attendants entered ahead of him, filling the square with dancers, nobles, priests, and servants. It was not a procession of war, but of ceremony. Atahualpa rode in on a litter of gold, raised above the crowd, surrounded by his most trusted men. His tunic gleamed in the sunlight. He had brought no weapons. The gods were watching. Peace would be honored, but in the shadows of the stone walls, the Spanish were waiting. Hidden behind doors and beneath cloaks, they clutched muskets and swords. A priest named Vicente de Valverde stepped forward first, holding up a Bible and speaking through an interpreter. He demanded that Atahualpa accept the Christian faith and submit to the Spanish crown. Atahualpa, confused and insulted, took the book and turned its pages. When he heard nothing from it, he cast it aside. The priest cried out that this was blasphemy. Then the signal was given. The square exploded. A cannon blast tore through the air, echoing off the stones. From every corner, Spanish soldiers charged on horseback, something the Inca had never seen. Steel flashed, muskets roared. The peaceful gathering became a massacre. Attendants, unarmed and terrified, fled in every direction, only to be cut down or trampled. Screams rose to the sky. Dust choked the air. Blood darkened the stones. Atahualpa, still seated on his golden litter, was seized. His carriers were killed, but the king was captured alive. The Spanish had been ordered not to harm him. He was too valuable. The plaza, once a place of music and joy, now stood silent, filled with bodies. In a single hour, the empire's most sacred symbol had been taken. The child of the sun was a prisoner. The gods had not stopped it. The stars did not speak. The world had shifted. A room full of gold. In the days that followed, the Inca people were stunned. Their emperor was alive, but no longer free. The Spanish held him in a room watched constantly, but treated with a strange kind of respect. They wanted something. They did not kill him. They waited. And Atahualpa, ever clever and calm, offered them the one thing they truly desired: gold. He promised them a ransom unlike any the world had ever seen. In exchange for his release, Atahualpa would fill the room he was held in with gold up to a line marked on the wall. And not only that, he would fill 2 more rooms with silver. The Spanish agreed. Word spread across the empire. From temples, homes, and storerooms, gold was gathered. Sacred objects were pulled from altars. Statues of gods were taken apart, their faces melted. Necklaces from noble women, chalices from priests, plates from royal halls. all carried to Cajamarca. Llamas trudged through the mountains, bearing treasures from every corner of Tawantinsuyo. The room began to fill. Day by day, the piles of gold rose higher. The Spanish watched in awe. They had never seen so much wealth. But behind their eyes, greed stirred darker thoughts. They feared Atahualpa would escape. They feared the Inca would strike back. They feared rebellion. And so, even as the last pieces of gold arrived, they made a secret decision. On a cold August night, in the quiet of his prison, Atahualpa was brought to a small chamber. He was told he would be tried. He was accused of conspiracy, of idolatry, of false rule. The charges were hollow, the trial a formality, and in the end the verdict was death to spare his soul. They offered him a Christian baptism. If he accepted, he would be strangled instead of burned. And so the son of the sun was baptized with a new name under a foreign god. Then the rope was drawn. The emperor of the Inca, who had once ruled over millions, fell silent forever. No trumpet sounded, no star fell. But in the hearts of his people, something sacred had been lost. Chapter 17. The Fall of Cusco. The high roads of the Andes wound like veins across the spine of an empire. Ancient paths laid stone by stone through mountain and valley, ridge and river. They were roads of order, of connection, of life itself. For generations, they had carried messengers, armies, and offerings toward the sacred city of Cusco, the heart of the Inca world. But now, those same roads carried something else, something colder, something foreign. Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish soldiers, numbering barely more than a few hundred, advanced step by step toward the navel of the world. They came not alone. The Andes were filled with memories of conquest, of subjugation, of peoples forced into the vast machine of Tawantinsuyo. Not everyone had forgotten. Alongside the Spaniards marched native groups who had once been conquered by the Inca tribes, and clans whose wounds still bled, who saw in the bearded strangers a chance for revenge, or at least for change. They did not carry Spanish steel, but they carried old anger. They were not allies of Spain, they were enemies of Cusco. As they moved southward from Cajamarca, the landscape began to shift. The air grew thinner, colder. Villages grew quieter, the people watching from doorways with guarded eyes. Word had spread of Atahualpa's death. The son of the sun was no more. The line had been broken. Now the roads felt hollow, like nerves, cut from a body. And yet, the invaders walked them with terrifying purpose. The roads themselves had been built to last. Smooth stones fitted tightly together with no mortar, able to withstand time and tremor. They were the pride of an empire. But now they led only to loss. The steps of conquistadors echoed down the valleys. And far ahead, nestled in the cradle of the mountains, Cusco waited, unarmed, unsure, and utterly sacred, brothers of war within. Cusco, the fires of confusion still burned. The civil war had shattered what unity the Inca once held. Huáscar, the deposed king, had been executed by Atahualpa. And now Atahualpa himself was dead strangled after fulfilling his ransom. The sun had been darkened. The throne, once divine, now stood empty. And into that silence the Spaniards stepped. But Pizarro, clever and deliberate, understood symbols. He knew that the Inca people revered order. Without a ruler, there could be no empire. And so he chose a young man named Manco Inca, royal by birth, the son of noble blood. He was crowned not by tradition, but by necessity, not to rule, but to be ruled. He became the Spaniards' puppet king. At first, Manco Inca bowed his head. He wore the royal fringe. He sat on the golden seat. He walked among the temples, smiling faintly for the eyes that watched him. But inside, something different stirred. He saw the way the Spaniards treated the holy places. He saw them enter the temple of the sun without removing their shoes. He saw them laugh at the sacred dances. He saw them steal. Golden discs were pulled from walls. Statues of gods were carried away. Priests were questioned, mocked, dismissed. And Manco, though still young, watched carefully. He had seen two brothers go to war. He had seen what it meant to lose family and faith. Now he played his part, silent and still. But in his silence, a seed of rebellion began to take root. The sacking of the city of Cusco, in the days before the fall, had been a living shrine. Its streets aligned with celestial bodies. Its walls were fitted so perfectly that not even a blade could slide between the stones. At its center stood the Coricancha, the temple of the sun, its walls once covered in sheets of gold, reflecting the first light of morning back to the heavens. Inside, golden figures of gods and sacred animals stood in quiet rows. Offerings of maize, carved entirely from precious metal, glimmered in the sunlight. It was not a place of wealth, it was a place of wonder. And then, the Spaniards entered. In November of 1533, they arrived at the gates of Cusco. There was no grand battle, no mighty siege. The city opened, and they walked in. What followed was not conquest, it was looting. They saw not temples, but treasuries. They saw not gods, but gold. The Coricancha was stripped. The golden plates that once coated its walls were pried off. Statues of the sun, moon, and stars were pulled down. Sacred vessels were taken from altars. Even the maize, the golden maize, crafted to honor the spirits of agriculture, was packed into crates and carted away. What had taken centuries to build was undone in days. The Spaniards melted the treasures into bars for easy transport. The faces of gods became faceless bricks. The artistry, the prayers, the ceremonies that had given these objects meaning were ignored. They were now just weight currency to be shipped across the ocean to another world. As the cold of winter settled over Cusco, its sacred heart was emptied. The temple stood bare. The priests wandered, their rituals interrupted, and the people watched in silence, unable to stop the unraveling of their world. Ashes in the sky. In time, the smoke began to rise, not just from the fires of cooking or warmth, but from the flames of destruction. Temples once dedicated to Inti, the sun god, were burned to the ground. The sek lines, those invisible cords of spiritual connection that radiated from Cusco to every part of the empire, were broken, scattered, or forgotten. Pilgrimage routes were left to overgrow. Ceremonies once timed to the solstice went unmarked. The empire's sacred calendar turned to dust. The Spanish built churches atop temples. They planted their crosses where once stood golden icons. The city that had been mapped by stars was now measured in coin. The balance had shifted. And yet, something lingered. For the Inca, Cusco was more than stone and gold. It was the center of the world, not just physically, but spiritually. It had been chosen by the gods. And though the buildings now echoed with foreign voices, and the sacred places were defiled, the spirit of Cusco did not vanish, it retreated. Into memory, into the folds of the mountains, into the people. Elders whispered the old names to children. Farmers still raised their eyes to the same constellations. The sun still rose over the eastern peaks, painting the valleys in gold. And though the empire had been torn apart, its breath still lived in the wind. The conquerors had taken the city, yes, but not the soul. The Andes held their silence. The stones remained. And in quiet corners of the land, the heartbeat of Tawantinsuyu still pulsed softly, steadily, like a rhythm remembered in sleep. Chapter 18. The Last Sanctuary. The smoke of conquest still hung over Cusco, drifting through the broken streets and bare temples like a memory that would not leave. But far from silence, a voice rose again. Manco Inca, once the Spaniards' chosen puppet, once crowned with a pretense of peace, had turned. The betrayal had been too much, the desecration too deep. And from the heart of grief came a fire that could not be smothered. In 1536, Manco Inca slipped away from the watchers. His escape was quiet, careful. But what followed was anything but small. In a movement that seemed to rise from the very earth, thousands of Inca and their allies took up arms. Stones, slings, spears, and fire. What they lacked in steel, they made up for in will. They surged upon Cusco, laying siege to the old capital with a fury not seen since the time of the first Cepa Inca. For 10 long months, the rebellion burned. Cusco, still held by the Spaniards, became a prison of fear. Food ran low, water was cut off, every path out was watched. The Inca warriors, dressed in simple tunics and war paint, struck at night from the hills, from the shadows. Drums beat from the ridges, fires lit the sky. And for a moment, it seemed the old gods had returned, but the Spanish held. With guns, horses, and iron, they clung to their prize. Supplies arrived from Lima. Reinforcements followed. And slowly, the siege began to break. Manco Inca saw what was coming. He knew the city could not be reclaimed. But something more important had happened. The world had seen that the Inca were not broken. The spirit had not died. The sun still had suns. And so, Manco turned his gaze away from Cusco, not in defeat, but in decision. If the old capital could not be saved, then a new sanctuary would rise, one hidden from foreign eyes, one built where the jungle met the clouds. The story of resistance was only just beginning. A road to Vilcabamba beyond the sacred valley, where the highlands begin to melt into green, a road winds into mystery. Here, the air thickens, the sun softens. Rivers speak in hushed tones beneath layers of vines and mist. It was to this land that Manco Inca retreated deep into the folds of the Andes, where only the brave or the desperate dared to go. There, in a hidden cradle of mountains and jungle, a new capital was born, Vilcabamba. Unlike Cusco, it was not grand. It did not shine with gold, but it was sacred. The Inca who came with Manco did not arrive as lords, they arrived as survivors. And yet, they built. They laid stones in careful lines. They raised shrines to the sun and moon. They resumed the rituals that had once marked the days and seasons. In Vilcabamba, they remembered who they were. The jungle watched over them. Its dense trees and steep cliffs became a shield. Roads were narrow, bridges light. The Spanish could not move easily here. Even the horses grew tired on the narrow paths. And so Vilcabamba, though small, was safe. Manco ruled not as a puppet, but as a sovereign. He wore the fringe of royal blood, and spoke as the heir of Pachacati. Though the empire was gone, its echo lived on in this green sanctuary. Royal scribes recorded what they could remember. Priests taught children the old prayers. Farmers grew maize in tight terraces, and at night, songs still rose to the stars. Vilcabamba became more than a city. It was a memory made real, a living resistance, a quiet vow that not all had been lost. Years in the shadows for 40 years. The Inca lived in the hush between worlds. They governed as best they could. They sent emissaries to distant valleys, rekindling ties with what allies remained. Messages were whispered between villages. Paths were walked only at night. And though the Spanish controlled the highlands, they could not reach the heart of the forest. The rulers of Vilcabamba passed their crown with dignity. Manco Inca was followed by his sons Seri Tupac, then Titu Cusi, then Tupac Amaru. Each held the torch for a time. Some tried to make peace. Seri Tupac once traveled to Lima and was offered land and titles. But he returned uneasy, sensing that the Inca could not truly live under Spanish rule. Titu Cusi tried diplomacy, writing letters, sending gifts. For a time, the Spanish left Vilcabamba alone, but it was never safe. There were always rumors, always tensions. Some Spaniards saw Vilcabamba as a thorn that must be pulled. Others saw it as a mystery to be solved. Expeditions came and went, some never returning. The jungle kept its secrets. In Vilcabamba, time passed in a different rhythm. Children were born who had never seen Cusco. They grew up knowing only the rivers, the birds, the quiet temples half covered in moss. But they learned the stories. They learned of Inti, the sun. They learned of the four corners of the world. They learned that their people had once stretched from the sea to the mountains. And they learned that they still carried that legacy. Within them. The world beyond changed. The Spanish built cities. They planted churches. They wrote new laws. But deep in the green folds of Vilcabamba, the Inca calendar turned on its own wheel. The fire was still burning small, but steady. The last flame in 1572, the silence was broken. A new viceroy had come to Peru, and he had no patience for shadows. The Neo-Inca state was labeled a threat. The time for tolerance had ended. Soldiers were sent. Guides were paid. The jungle was breached. Vilcabamba was not built to resist a full invasion. Its strength had been in secrecy. Now, with torches and armor, the Spanish pressed through the forest. Skirmishes flared. Paths were blocked. But the numbers were too many. The shield of the trees could not hold forever. Tupac Amaru I, the last Sepa Inca, fled deeper into the mountains, but he was found, captured, taken in chains to Cusco, the city his ancestors had built, the city that had once held golden walls and sacred flame. Now he stood in its shadow, a prisoner in the land of his birth. In the plaza where kings had once spoken to the sun. The last king of the Inca was executed. There were no trumpets, no final battles, no sudden storms in the sky, only the quiet closing of a chapter. And yet something remained. The name Tupac Amaru would echo for centuries. In later years, others would rise, bearing that name as a banner. Rebels, dreamers, those who still felt the mountains speak. those who believed that the sun might rise again. The last flame had been taken, but the warmth lingered. In the soil, in the stories, in the people who still spoke Quechua, still walked the old roads, still planted maize on the terraces carved by ancestors. The empire was gone. But the soul of the Andes, like the mist over Vilcabamba, never truly faded.